In the early years of the 12th century, the King of France had a problem that sounds like a joke. He could not safely ride from Paris to Orléans. These were his two chief cities. They sat barely 100 miles apart, joined by an old Roman road, and both of them flew his banner. But halfway between them rose the Tower of Montlhéry, and the man collecting tolls on that road did not answer to the king. Travellers hired armed escorts, or paid the lord in the tower, or vanished. One king of France called that tower the torment that had made him old before his time. His son would spend 30 years of his reign burning out towers like it, one at a time. Now watch the same crown, 200 years later. In the autumn of 1307, sealed orders rode out from Paris to royal officers in every province of the kingdom, with strict instructions that no seal be broken before one appointed morning. At dawn on Friday, October the 13th, the seals came open together, and by nightfall nearly every Knight Templar in France, brothers of the richest and most feared military order in Christendom, sat under arrest. Thousands of men, taken in a single morning, without one battle fought. Same crown, same family, 341 years, 15 kings, one unbroken line. This is the story of what happened in between, how the weakest royal house in Western Europe turned a paper title into France itself, and why, at the exact moment their crown stood strongest, their sons began to disappear. The ceremony worked like this. A great duke rode to meet the king, and he usually arrived with an armed escort, larger than the king's entire household. He took off his sword. He knelt. He placed his folded hands between the hands of the king, and he swore, before God and the assembled lords, to be the king's faithful man, to serve him, to owe him loyalty against every enemy. The king raised him up and kissed him on the mouth, and the thing was done. Then the duke rode home, and home was a country of its own, where he minted coins stamped with his own name, judged and hanged criminals by his own law, built castles without asking anyone, and waged private wars against his neighbours. He sent the King of France nothing. He paid no tax, and he owed none. The oath came with military service attached, in theory, for a set number of days each year, and even that service arrived late, or thin, or never. The kiss was real. The kneeling was real. What the king actually collected from it was a gesture. That was the kingdom of West Francia at the end of the 10th century. The ancestor of the country we call France, and it existed mostly on parchment. It had been carved out 5 generations earlier. In 843, when the grandsons of Charlemagne split his empire 3 ways, the western third kept the crown, the ceremonies, and the memory of the great emperor. Real power drained outward, generation by generation, into the hands of the men who could build a castle and hold it. Walk the map, and you can measure what remained. Start in the northwest, in Normandy, within living memory. The men who ruled there had been Viking pirates rowing up the Seine to burn monasteries. In 911, a desperate king cut a deal with their chief, a huge Norseman named Rollo, and handed him the lower Seine valley to settle, hiring one wolf to keep out the pack. It worked in the strangest way possible. Within 3 generations, Rollo's descendants spoke French. endowed churches, and ruled through counts and bishops like everyone else, and they had quietly become the most dangerous soldiers in Europe. They bowed to the King of France in ceremony. In practice, the Duke of Normandy did exactly as the Duke of Normandy pleased. South of the Loire, matters were worse. Because south of the Loire, the king barely existed. Aquitaine covered something like a third of the kingdom. Its people spoke a different language than Paris, prayed to their own saints, and followed dukes so grand that their documents sometimes read as if they ruled a separate monarchy, which in every practical sense they did. Whole generations of southern nobles lived and died without once laying eyes on a king of the Franks. The Count of Flanders sat in the far north on a knot of cloth, towns and river trade that made him richer than the crown. The Count of Anjou was clawing territory from his neighbours along the Loire, and the most famous of that line, Fulk the Black, built a chain of stone fortresses, burned his enemies' towns, burned his own wife at the stake, and then walked barefoot to Jerusalem, twice, to balance the books with God. Champagne and Blois belonged to a family that would spend a century trying to surround Paris, and on the far Mediterranean edge of the map sat Barcelona, which learned its lesson in 985, when a Muslim army sacked the city and the Count sent north begging his king for rescue. No army ever came. The county stopped asking, and the kingdom's southern border quietly began to forget it had a king at all. Against all of this, what did the crown actually hold? A strip of territory running from Paris down through Orléans, some scattered estates and abbeys, and the loyalty of the church. That was the royal domain, and it was smaller than the lands of half a dozen of the king's own vassals. The king's revenue could not match the Count of Flanders. His soldiers could not match the Duke of Normandy. Even inside his own little corridor, minor lords sat in stone towers along the roads, robbing merchants and defying royal orders, and the king lacked the strength to pull them down. And yet nobody moved to take the crown from him. That is the strange part. The great dukes could have any two of them together commanded the force to do it. They never tried, because the crown as it stood suited them perfectly. It was near, it was weak, and it was occupied. An anointed king, blessed with holy oil in the tradition, running back to Charlemagne, sat at the top of the whole feudal pyramid and asked nothing of anyone. His weakness underwrote everyone else's independence. A strong claimant on that throne was a threat, a feeble one was a convenience, and the great men of the kingdom understood the difference precisely. The family that had worn this convenient crown for 2 centuries was Charlemagne's own, the Carolingians, and by the 980s they were nearly spent. The last kings of the line ruled from the fortress town of Leon on its high rock, shuffling a shrinking inheritance, borrowing soldiers, begging favours from the very dukes who were supposed to serve them. In 986, King Lothair died. His son Louis, the 5th of that name, was about 20 years old, and he lasted a single year. In May of 987, the young king rode out hunting, fell, and died of his injuries. He left no son. The house of Charlemagne, the bloodline that had crowned emperors and terrified Europe, ran out in a forest accident. So the great men of the kingdom gathered to choose a king. There was a candidate of the old blood available, a grown man, experienced in war, uncle of the boy who had just died. The assembly looked at him carefully, and then looked past him, toward a middle-aged duke whose family had already worn the crown twice before, and had proven, both times, entirely capable of giving it back. They chose the safe man. On the 3rd of July, 987, in the Cathedral of Noyon, a small city northeast of Paris, an archbishop poured holy oil on the head of a duke in his late 40s and made him king of the Franks. Notice the city, because it is the wrong one. Later centuries would treat a French coronation as a fixed and ancient rite, performed at Reims, in the cathedral where Clovis was baptized, with oil from a sacred vial that legend said a dove had carried down from heaven. Kings would be made there for 800 years, and the ceremony would come to feel as old as the hills. It was not old yet. In 987, the tradition was still loose, still negotiable, and the first king of the new dynasty was anointed in a modest cathedral most people today have never heard of. Even the sacred parts of French kingship had to be built, piece by piece, like everything else in this story. The man under the oil was named Hugh, Duke of the Franks, master of that thin corridor of land from Paris to Orléans. History knows him by a nickname, Capet, which may have referred to the little cape he wore as lay abbot of the monastery of Saint Martin of Tours. Nobody is certain, and he never used the name himself. It was the kind of offhand label that sticks to a man after he is dead, and this one stuck to his descendants for 8 centuries. His family already had a history with the crown, and everyone in the cathedral knew it, 100 years earlier. When Vikings besieged Paris, the man who held the city walls was Hugh's great-uncle, Odo. A grateful kingdom crowned him, and when he died, the crown went back to the House of Charlemagne. A generation later, the family reached for it again. Hugh's grandfather Robert took the throne in 922 and was dead within the year. Killed in battle against the king he had replaced. Twice this family had worn the crown of the Franks. Twice it had slipped away, back to the old dynasty, as if some gravity pulled it there. In 987, no sensible person would have bet on the third attempt, lasting 341 years. The men who arranged the election were churchmen, and they were the sharpest political minds in the kingdom. Adalbero, Archbishop of Reims, presided over the assembly of great lords at Senlis that made the choice. At his side worked his secretary, Gerbert of Aurillac, a monk of obscure birth and dazzling learning who had studied mathematics on the Spanish frontier of the Muslim world, taught half the ruling class of Europe, and would end his life as Pope in Rome in the year 1000. A chronicler who admired these men recorded the argument Adalbero laid before the assembly. So the fine words come to us polished. The kingdom, he argued, was not a piece of property. The crown did not pass by blood, right alone. The lords should raise up the man fittest to rule. It was a high-minded speech in service of a practical decision, because there was a candidate of the blood standing right there. Charles of Lorraine was the dead king's uncle, a true Carolingian, a grown soldier with a legitimate claim by every custom of inheritance. He was also, from the assembly's point of view, defective in useful ways. He held his duchy as a vassal of the German emperor, which made him another ruler's man. He had married beneath himself, the daughter of a minor knight, and the great lords never let him forget it. The bishops distrusted him, but strip away every stated objection, and the real one stands underneath, unspoken and solid. Charles might have made a strong king, The assembly did not want a strong king. The blood argument bent easily, because it was never the argument that mattered. So Hugh was chosen, and Hugh was crowned, and the oil dried, and almost nothing changed. The dukes of Normandy and Aquitaine did not suddenly obey him. His revenue did not grow. His soldiers did not multiply. A story from these years, written down a generation later by a chronicler in the south, catches the new reign's exact temperature. A count in Perigord had seized the city of Tours, and King Hugh sent him a furious demand. "Who made you count?" And the count sent back an answer that every baron in France could have signed. "Who made you kings?" The story may be improved in the telling, the way good stories are. It survived because it told the truth. The men who had elected Hugh Capet saw no reason to fear him, and they were right. The one man who refused to accept the election was the one man the election had passed over. In 988, Charles of Lorraine struck, and struck well. He seized Laon, the old Carolingian capital on its high rock, the strongest fortress town in the north, and from those walls he declared himself the rightful king. Hugh marched, besieged the rock, and failed. He came back and besieged it again, and failed again. The new dynasty, 1 year old, could not take a single city from a rival with a fraction of its resources, and the war settled into a stalemate that dragged on for 3 years while the kingdom watched to see which way the wind would blow. What broke the stalemate was a bishop and a bed, Adalbero of Laon, called Asselin, had been driven from his city when Charles took it, and he wanted it back, so he made his peace with Charles. Publicly and warmly, he swore his loyalty. He was received back inside the walls, restored to his church, trusted at the prince's table. He waited through the winter, and during Lent of 991, on a night when the household lay asleep, his men seized Charles in his bed, along with his wife and children, and delivered them all to King Hugh. Charles went into a tower in Orléans and died there within a year or two. His sons faded into Lorraine and out of history. The first dynastic war of the House of Capet was decided by a perjured bishop while everyone slept, and France never forgot the man who did it. Chroniclers were still calling Asselin the traitor a century later. Hugh Capet was now king in fact as well as name, and it changed his standing not at all. His great vassals ignored him as thoroughly as they had ignored the Carolingians. Foreign courts dealt with him politely, as one deals with a caretaker. Everyone could do the arithmetic. This family had held the crown twice and handed it back twice, and nothing about the third attempt looked different. The reasonable expectation, shared across the kingdom, was that the Capetians were an interval, a pause between two real dynasties, and that the crown would wander again the moment this aging duke was gone. Hugh seems to have agreed with them. That is the only way to explain the speed of what he did next. Within 6 months of the oil touching his own head, he was arranging a second coronation, in a different city, with the same crown, and the man he intended to crown was not himself. 6 months after Noyon, the kingdom got a second coronation. This one came on Christmas Day, 987, in the Cathedral of Orléans, and the man kneeling under the oil was not a man at all. He was a teenager named Robert, and his father stood beside him through the whole ceremony, alive, healthy, and already wearing the crown of the Franks. When the rite was finished, The kingdom that had spent 2 centuries burying kings before replacing them suddenly had 2 of them at once. A senior king and a junior king, ruling jointly, father and son. The churchmen did not like it. Archbishop Adalbero, the same man who had preached at Senlis that the crown should go to the worthiest and not simply to the nearest blood, objected that 2 kings could not properly be created in a single year. He understood exactly what was being done to his own argument. An elected king was now installing his heir by arrangement, converting the assembly's free choice into family property before the assembly's eyes. Hugh had an answer ready, and the answer was an emergency. Word had come from the south that summer, from the Count of Barcelona, pleading for help against the armies that had sacked his city. Hugh declared he would march to the rescue, and a king riding to war on a distant frontier needed a crowned colleague at home, so that if he fell, the kingdom would not fall with him. It was reasonable. It was even true, as far as it went. No army ever marched for Barcelona, and the rescue quietly evaporated once the coronation was safely done. The emergency had served its purpose, which was standing at the altar in Orléans, wearing a crown. Nobody fought it. That is the remarkable part. The great lords who had just exercised their ancient right to elect a king watched that right begin to close in front of them, and they let it pass. Because a boy sharing his father's throne threatened no one, the dukes still had their armies, their coins, their courts. What was one more ceremony in a weak little kingdom that could not even take Léon without a traitor's help? The ceremony was the whole invention. The Capetians had found the one move available to a family with no money, no army, and no prestige. They could not force anyone to obey them. They could make sure the throne was never, ever empty. An election needs a vacancy. Remove the vacancy, and you remove the election, without abolishing anything, without winning a single battle, without anyone quite noticing the moment the door shut. The family would run the same play for generations. Each king, once his eldest son was old enough to hold still through the ceremony, brought the boy to a cathedral and had him anointed and crowned as junior king, co-ruler in name, heir in fact, son after son, for nearly 200 years, until the day came when the habit was no longer needed, and that day would be its own kind of milestone, a sign the machine had finally learned to stand on its own. In October of 996, Hugh Capet died of an illness near Paris. He had worn the crown for 9 years, won no famous victories, added nothing to the royal lands, and impressed almost nobody. Watch what happened next. No assembly gathered. No archbishop weighed the candidates. No duke saddled a horse. The kingdom woke to find it already had a king, anointed years before, reigning for nearly a decade, and there was nothing to discuss, and no one to discuss it with. Robert simply continued, and, continuing, it turned out, was the whole trick. Around the year 1000, by an account that came down through the church, the King of France ate his meals almost alone. Servants had deserted the palace. Courtiers found reasons to be elsewhere. Of the household that remained, the story says, 2 servants stayed at his side, and even they threw the leavings of his table to the dogs, and scoured with fire the vessels his mouth had touched. As if the king's own dishes carried contagion, the king was Robert, second of that name, the teenager from the Christmas coronation, now a grown man in the deepest trouble a medieval soul could know. He had been excommunicated by the Pope. His crime was his marriage. Robert had wed Bertha of Burgundy, a widowed cousin, close enough in blood that church law called the union incest, and Rome ordered him to give her up. He refused. The ban came down, cutting him off from the sacraments, from salvation, and, as the story of the burned dishes shows, from ordinary human company. The tale is surely improved in the telling. It was written by a churchman with a lesson to sell. What it preserves is the size of the weapon the church could swing at a king, and the fact that this particular king stood in front of it for years, stubborn as a post, before he finally yielded, sent Bertha away, and made a new marriage the lawyers could live with. Now, note what did not happen. No rival seized his crown. No assembly met to replace him. The most humiliated king in Christendom kept his throne through the whole affair and died in it. In 1031, having reigned 35 years, Robert the Pious, they called him, and the name fit the rest of the man. He sang in the choir stalls beside his monks. He fed paupers at his own table. He also stood by at Orléans in 1022 while heretics burned. Among the first such fires in the history of medieval Europe, and saw no contradiction anywhere. His piety had edges. Sanctity usually does. In this family, and it will again. The next 2 reigns cover most of a century, and the kingdom's map barely moved. Robert's son, Henry, spent his early years as king fighting his own mother and younger brother, who thought the younger brother should have the crown. Henry won, barely, and the price of peace was handing his brother the Duchy of Burgundy, a vast piece of the family's holdings, gone into a cousin's line for 300 years, to find a wife whose bloodline the church could not object to. Henry had to send ambassadors past every royal house in Western Europe, all of them tangled in his family tree, all the way to Kiev, on the edge of the known world. The bride who came back, Anna of Kiev, signed royal documents in the letters of her own Eastern alphabet, while the great lords of France scratched crosses beside her name, because she could write and they could not. In Var, Henry met the one neighbour no king of France could afford as an enemy. The Duchy of Normandy had passed to a boy of about 8. William, a bastard son, surrounded by murdered guardians, and Henry first propped him up, then turned on him when the boy grew strong. It went badly twice. At Mortimer, a French army was surprised and cut to pieces in a burning village, while Henry, with the other half of his forces, could only listen. 3 years later, at Varaville, William caught the royal army as it crossed a tidal river, waited until the water split it in 2, then destroyed the stranded half, while the King of France watched from the far bank. Henry died in 1060, beaten every time it mattered, and left the crown to Philip, a boy of 7 with a strange Greek name his Kievan mother had brought from the east. Philip reigned 48 years, longer than any king of France before him, and the chroniclers of his own day buried him in scorn. He grew fat and idle. They said, in his middle years, he fell for Bertrade of Montfort, the wife of the Count of Anjou, and took her and married her, while both their lawful spouses were still living, and for that the church cut him off exactly as it had cut off his father. The timing became its own punishment. In 1095, at Clermont, in the middle of Philip's own kingdom, the Pope stood before a vast crowd and called the knights of Christendom to march for Jerusalem. The First Crusade emptied the kingdom of its best men. The Duke of Normandy went. Great counts and lords went by the hundreds. Into legend. The King of France stayed home, fat and excommunicated, forbidden even to wear his crown in public, a spectator at the greatest event of his age. That is the surface, and the surface is real. Under it, something else was happening. Because idle, scandalous, Philip never stopped buying. A stretch of land here, a castle there, half the Vexin on the Norman border, and in 1101 the town and territory of Bourges, purchased outright from a lord who needed cash to go crusading. None of it glorious, all of it kept. The royal domain that Philip passed on was larger than the one he inherited, gathered acre by acre, while the chroniclers sneered. And this quiet arithmetic, land in, land never out, was as close to a family policy as the early Capetians ever had. One event of these years towered over everything, and the Capetians could only stand and watch it. In the autumn of 1066, Duke William of Normandy, the same man who had shredded 2 royal armies, loaded ships with horses and knights, crossed the Channel, and conquered the Kingdom of England in a single afternoon of slaughter near Hastings. The Duke was now a king. He still knelt, in theory, for Normandy. He now also wore a crown of his own, anointed and equal, with a whole conquered island behind it. A vassal of France commanded revenues and armies beyond anything his lord in Paris could dream of, and every future king of England would inherit both the French lands and the French oath that came with them. Nobody in Paris could do anything about it, except wait. The waiting would last 150 years, and the bill, when it finally came due, would be the making of this dynasty, total up the ledger of the quiet century. 3 kings, Robert, Henry, Philip. Between them, no great victory, no famous reign, 2 excommunications, and a legacy of chroniclers' contempt, and 3 entries on the other side of the page. Every one of them lived long. Every one of them left a son. Every one of them crowned that son as junior king, while he himself still breathed, so that the throne of France was never vacant for a single day in over a century. Meanwhile, the great houses around them kept stumbling on exactly this. Normandy, after the conqueror died, went to war with itself, brother against brother. For a generation, Anjou tore between rival heirs. Burgundy passed out of one line and into another. Dynasties, with everything, kept fumbling the handoff. The dynasty with nothing completed it every time. And slowly, without a battle, the mere fact of the Capetians began to harden into something like a law of nature. There had always been a king in Paris. There had always been a son. In the summer of 1108, Philip died at Melun, and the old nervousness flickered one last time. His heir Louis did not wait for Reims, did not wait for the proper assembly of lords, did not wait at all. Within days he had himself crowned at Orléans, quickly and quietly, before his half-brother, Bear Trade's son, could stir up trouble around the succession. It was the reflex of a family that still, after 4 generations, took nothing for granted. Then the new king turned to look at his inheritance. This little corridor of land his ancestors had held and held and held, and the towers along its roads where petty lords sat robbing his merchants and laughing at his writs. Louis was in his late 20s, thick-bodied and getting thicker. Balding young, loud, cheerful, and almost impossible to exhaust. His father had been a man who could watch an insult and shrug. The son could not. The holding was over. The tower at Le Puisay was not much to look at. A mound of packed earth, a wooden palisade, a keep, a ditch, sitting in open wheat country southwest of Paris, 2 days' ride from the king's own hall. The lord who held it was named Hugh, and his family had turned that unremarkable mound into an engine for eating a province. From Le Puisay, Hugh's riders shook down merchants on the Orléans road, plundered the lands of the Cathedral of Chartres, and stripped the abbey's granges at harvest. When churchmen complained to him, he laughed. When they complained to the king, everyone understood that the crown had been failing to solve men like Hugh for 100 years. He was not a duke or a count. He was a local thug with a good ditch. And he was, in the year 1111, about to become the main character in the reign of Louis VI. Louis came to the throne in 1108, and the shape of his kingship was set within a few seasons. He would spend almost none of his reign fighting the great princes of the realm, because he could not beat them, and both sides knew it. He spent it instead on the small men, the tower lords of the royal domain itself, the robbers sitting on his own roads. It was war at the bottom of the scale, local, muddy, repetitive, and unglamorous. It was also the most consequential fighting any Capetian had yet done, because a king who could not rule the 100 miles around Paris was a king in name only, and every duke in France could see it. So the king besieged Le Puisay. He took it, burned the palisade, filled the ditch, and rode home with Hugh in chains. Then he pardoned him, because Hugh had powerful kin and the politics required it, and Hugh went back and rebuilt. So the king came back too. A second siege, harder than the first, with royal foot soldiers dying in the ditch, and a second surrender, and a second demolition, and then a third, because Hugh of Le Puisay was nothing if not consistent. 3 times in 5 years the King of France marched an army against one earthwork castle in his own backyard. The 3rd time, the crown kept the ground. If you want a measure of how weak this monarchy actually was, and how it began to stop being weak, that is the measure. One local ditch, filled 3 times, and the 3rd filling held. The chronicler who recorded these little wars, blow by blow, was a monk named Suger, and he deserves a moment, because without him we would barely have this reign at all. He had entered the Abbey of Saint-Denis as a boy of about 10, a poor man's son given to the church, and at the abbey school he was thrown together with a prince of exactly his own age. The 2 boys grew up side by side, and the friendship held for life. Suger rose to be abbot of Saint-Denis, the royal burial church north of Paris, and something like the king's chief minister, negotiator, and memory. He rebuilt his abbey church with pointed arches and walls of coloured glass, and architectural historians point to that building as the beginning of the style the world now calls Gothic. In his spare hours he wrote the life of his friend, the king, which is why we know about the dishes and the ditches, and why we should also squint a little at the portrait's shine. Suger was a witness, and he was also a publicist. What no one disputes is the partnership itself. A king of France, governing through a baker's son in a monk's habit, chosen for brains, This dynasty's habit of promoting clever men of low birth and arming them with parchment instead of swords starts here. It ends 2 centuries later with a royal lawyer laying hands on a pope. The dirtiest of the Tower Wars had a villain even the age found shocking. Thomas of Maule held castles in the rough country northeast of Paris and ran them as a private hell. The abbot Guibert of Nogent, who lived nearby and knew the man, wrote that Thomas hung prisoners by their thumbs, weighted them with stones, and starved them for ransom, and that no one could count the men who died in his pits. Church councils condemned him. His own father despised him. For years he did as he pleased. Because that was the whole point of a castle. It took Louis 2 separate campaigns, decades apart, to finish Thomas of Maule, and the second one ended with the old butcher dying a prisoner while the king confiscated what was left of his nest. Slow justice, but royal justice, and men noticed the difference between a council that cursed a tyrant and a king who actually dug him out. Underneath all this mud, something abstract was being built. Every filled ditch converted into it. The roads got safer. So the merchants moved. So the tolls and the markets grew. So Paris fattened. The abbeys and cathedral towns of the domain, robbed for generations, learned that the king's protection was worth having and worth paying for. Petitions started riding toward Paris from churches far outside the royal lands, from Flanders, from Burgundy, from the south, asking the king to arbitrate, to confirm, to shield. He could not compel those distant places. He could answer when asked. And he made a policy of answering. A king too weak to command the kingdom was quietly becoming the kingdom's court of appeal, one invitation at a time. Then, in 1124, the reign got its one great day. The German emperor, allied with the King of England, assembled an army to invade France from the east. Aimed at Reims, Louis did the only thing he could do. He called for help, and he called in a particular way. At Saint-Denis, he took up from the altar the banner of the abbey, a plain red silk standard that men called the oriflamme, and proclaimed that the king marched under the protection of the saint himself, and summoned the host of the realm to follow it. And the realm came. Contingents rode in from the great principalities, from Burgundy, from Champagne, from Blois, even from princes who spent most of their lives ignoring or fighting this king. An army assembled larger than anything a Capetian had ever commanded. So large that the emperor looked at it, found urgent business elsewhere, and went home without a battle. Nothing was fought. Everything was demonstrated. On an ordinary Tuesday, the Crown of France was a landlord with 100 miles of road. On the day the kingdom itself was threatened, the Crown was the only flag everyone would stand under. And now everyone had seen it proven. Louis got old the way he had lived. Hugely. The chroniclers say that by his mid-50s he was too fat to mount a horse, and he governed from a litter, still loud, still moving, still besieging the occasional tower by proxy. In the summer of 1137, dying of dysentery at a hunting lodge, he received the news that would decide the next 70 years of French history. Though it arrived dressed as a windfall, Duke William, the 10th of Aquitaine, lord of that enormous southern third of the kingdom where royal writ had never truly run, had died on pilgrimage in Spain, at the shrine of St. James, on Good Friday. He left no son, the heir to everything. Aquitaine, Poitou, Gascony, 100 lordships between the Loire and the Pyrenees, was his daughter Eleanor, 15 years old, and her dying father's wish, carried north by envoys riding relay, was that the King of France take the girl into his protection and marry her to his son. Louis the Fat did not waste his luck. Within weeks, a wedding party of 500 knights was riding south through the summer heat, escorting the crown prince to Bordeaux. The old king died before they returned, on the 1st of August, 1137, and he died, believing he had just handed his house the greatest prize any Capetian had ever touched, the whole South, folded into the family by a single wedding. He can be forgiven for thinking so. Everyone thought so. The wedding took place in the Cathedral of St. Andrew in Bordeaux on the 25th of July, 1137, and the two people at the altar had met for the first time about 2 weeks earlier. The groom was 16, tall, fair, and gentle, and he was a king's son who had never been meant for a throne. Louis had been the second boy, the spare, raised at the cathedral school of Notre Dame in Paris for a life in the church, and by every account the life would have suited him. Then, 6 years before the wedding, his older brother Philip, out riding in the streets of Paris, had his horse trip over a stray black pig rooting in the mud. Philip went over the horse's head, struck the ground, and died the next day. That is how close this story runs on accident. A pig in a Paris street killed the heir of France, pulled a quiet boy out of the cloister, and put him on the road to Bordeaux. The boy never fully left the cloister behind. All his life. Men, said Louis, the seventh prayed like a monk, dressed plainly, and trusted people the way saints and fools do. The bride was 15, and she was the most valuable unmarried person in Europe. Eleanor had grown up in the richest and most sophisticated court in the West, at Poitiers and Bordeaux, in a family famous for appetite. Her grandfather, Duke William IX, was the first troubadour whose songs survive, a crusader and a scandal who versified about his mistresses while the church excommunicated him at intervals. The court that raised Eleanor sang in the southern tongue, spent money like water, and bowed to no one, least of all to Paris. She came to her wedding with a dowry of roughly 1/3 of the kingdom, and by the terms of the match, Aquitaine would pass to the son. She and Louis would have one healthy boy, and the map of France was solved forever. 2 weeks into the marriage, the crown moved from hope to fact. Word came north that the old king was dead. The honeymoon party turned around, and the 16-year-old and the 15-year-old rode back as king and queen of France. The marriage that followed lasted 15 years, and it failed in the 2 ways that mattered most. One private, one public. The private failure came first. Louis fell in love with his wife, genuinely, awkwardly, and by the testimony of the age, visibly, and Eleanor did not fall in love back. The famous line attributed to her, that she had thought to marry a king, and found she had married a monk, may be a later polish, and it survives for the usual reason. It summarized what everyone could see. He was devout, careful, and plain. She was quick, worldly, and bored. The court of Paris, damp stone and psalms, was not the court of Poitiers, and the queen made no secret of the difference. The public failure was arithmetic. Year followed year, and no child came at all. Then, In 1145, a child came and was a daughter. In a kingdom where the crown's whole survival trick was the sun, always the sun. The nursery stood at the center of state policy, and the nursery was quiet. In the middle of this cold marriage, the king did something that scarred him for life. Pressing a petty war against the Count of Champagne in 1143, royal troops stormed the little town of Vitry. The population, more than 1,000 townspeople, by the reports that spread, took refuge in the church, the way people always did, because even in war, the church was sanctuary. The fires the soldiers set reached it anyway. Louis watched the burning from a rise outside the town, close enough to hear it, and his advisers said afterward that he could not speak for days. The dead of Vitry sat on him like a stone he could not put down. When, 2 years later, preachers began to cry a new crusade, because the crusader city of Edessa in the east had fallen. The King of France did not merely take the cross for policy. He took it like a man paying off a debt, and he announced that the Queen would come with him to Jerusalem. The Second Crusade was a catastrophe from nearly the first mile, and it broke what was left of the marriage. The German army travelling ahead was slaughtered in Asia Minor. The French army followed into the same mountains in winter and was cut apart at the passes, the king himself fighting for his life, at one point among the baggage, scrambling up rocks while his rearguard died around him. What limped into the Crusader port of Antioch in March of 1148 was the wreck of the host that had left France singing. Antioch was ruled by Eleanor's uncle Raymond, her father's younger brother, a tall, magnetic prince, only a few years older than she was. And for 10 days, the exhausted queen came alive. She and Raymond talked in their own southern tongue, laughed at jokes the Parisians could not follow, sat late, and planned. Raymond wanted the crusade to strike Aleppo, the real strategic prize, the move that might actually save the crusader east. Eleanor backed him loudly. Louis, sworn to reach Jerusalem, refused. And then the Queen said the unsayable. If Louis marched south, she would stay in Antioch. And she raised the question of whether their marriage, cousins as they were, had ever been lawful at all. Whatever else passed between uncle and niece in those 10 days was gossiped about across 2 continents and can never be known. What is documented is what the king did. He came at night, with soldiers, and took his queen out of Antioch by force. And the royal marriage of France proceeded to Jerusalem under armed guard. The crusade then bled itself white in a failed 4-day siege of Damascus and fell apart. Raymond of Antioch was dead within the year, killed in battle, his skull sent in a silver box to the Caliph in Baghdad. The king and queen sailed home on separate ships. Even the sea piled on, scattering the fleet, so that they landed weeks apart and met again on Italian soil. In Rome, the Pope himself took the couple in hand, personally reconciled them, and, in the words of the Chronicle, led them to a single bed. The result of the papal marriage counselling arrived in 1150, and it was a second daughter. That settled it. In the coldest possible terms, Louis needed a son more than he needed Aquitaine. As long as Eleanor was his wife, her duchy was his to administer, but not his to keep. It belonged to her heirs, and her heirs. After 15 years, were 2 girls. Somewhere in the royal council, the holy scruple and the dynastic panic shook hands. The same kinship that the church had winked at in 1137 was now discovered to be intolerable. In March of 1152, at the royal castle of Beaugency on the Loire. An obliging council of French bishops annulled the marriage of Louis and Eleanor on grounds of consanguinity, blood kinship within the forbidden degrees. Their daughters were declared legitimate and kept by the crown. Eleanor, 30 years old, got her freedom and every acre of Aquitaine back, and rode south for Poitiers the same season. She was now the greatest heiress in the world, unmarried, and travelling with a small escort through country full of ambitious men. The chronicles record that twice on that one journey, lords tried to take her on the road, to marry her at sword point and claim the south with her. The Count of Blois tried, and she slipped him by night. Further on, a 17-year-old Angevin princeling, Geoffrey Plantagenet, laid an ambush at a river crossing, and she was warned and swerved around it. Remember that boy's family name, because 8 weeks later she married his older brother. His name was Henry Plantagenet. He was 19, red-haired, bull-necked, already Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, a young man who by universal report never sat still, wore out horses, clerks, and enemies, and intended to be King of England, where his mother's stolen inheritance waited behind a civil war. Eleanor had met him the previous summer, when he passed through Paris, and the court whispered about the way the Queen and the young Duke looked at each other. Now she sent for him herself. On the 18th of May, 1152, in the cathedral at Poitiers, without asking anyone, the Duchess of Aquitaine married the Duke of Normandy in a quiet ceremony 8 weeks after her marriage to the King of France was dissolved. The technicality is what made the wedding a bomb. Both of them were vassals of King Louis, by feudal law. Neither could lawfully marry without their lord's consent, and marrying two of the greatest fiefs of France to each other behind the king's back was close to open rebellion. It was also done, sealed, and unbreakable, and the blood kinship that had just dissolved Eleanor's first marriage. She and Henry were related more closely than she and Louis had been. Nobody at Poitiers raised the point. 2 years later, in December of 1154, the civil war in England resolved, and Henry and Eleanor were crowned side by side in Westminster Abbey. Now stand where Louis stood, in Paris, and look at the map that his annulment had built. One man, one vassal, now held England entire, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and through his wife, Aquitaine and Gascony, from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. On the continent alone, Henry ruled more of France than the King of France. The royal domain, the little corridor that 5 generations of Capetians had scraped together acre by acre, sat surrounded on 3 sides by the lands of a single subject. And in 1153, Eleanor gave her new husband a son, then another, and another, and another after that. The woman who in 15 years in Paris had borne 2 daughters gave the Plantagenets 5 boys. The ceremony still worked the same way. A great lord took off his sword, knelt, and placed his folded hands between the hands of the King of France. What had changed was the man kneeling. He was the King of England now, and when he stood up and rode away, he rode through his own lands for 400 miles without once leaving them. This is the peace of the 12th century that a modern map cannot show. So it needs saying plainly, there was no war between the nation of England and the nation of France. because nobody involved thought in nations. Henry Plantagenet was a French prince who happened to hold an English crown. He was born in Le Mans, raised on the Loire, and spoke French his whole life. His English was thin at best. He spent well over half his reign on the continental side of the Channel, and when he died, he chose burial at the Abbey of Fontevraud in Anjou. In the country he considered home, England, to Henry, was a treasury and a title. The title mattered because it made him an anointed king. No man's inferior. The treasury mattered because English silver paid for his real life, which was ruling the western half of France. And for that western half, he owed homage to Paris. There sat the absurdity that shaped everything for 50 years. For England, Henry bowed to no one. For Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and Aquitaine, he was legally the sworn man of the King of France, bound by the same oath as any petty castellan. The oath cost him nothing day to day. Louis could not enforce a syllable of it, but the oath sat in the French archive like a signed confession, waiting for a generation with the strength to read it aloud. And the whole story of the next 2 chapters is the story of that document coming due. On paper, the contest between the 2 kings was a mismatch bordering on comedy. Henry's revenues dwarfed the French crown's. His lands wrapped around the royal domain from the Channel to the Pyrenees. He moved with a speed that frightened his own servants, appearing on frontiers where no one expected him, wearing out 4 horses in a day. One of his own clerks wrote that the king never sat down except to eat or ride, and that his court travelled so fast and so chaotically that courtiers slept in ditches and fought for shelter in barns. Against this force of nature stood Louis VII, pious, mild, twice widowed, a man whom the age had already filed away as the monk who lost Aquitaine. The filing was premature. Louis had no army to match Henry and knew it. So he never once offered the great battle Henry would have won. He fought instead with the only weapons a weak overlord possessed, and he turned out to be patient and shrewd with both of them. The first weapon was legitimacy. As anointed king and feudal overlord, Louis was the natural refuge for anyone with a grievance against Henry. And Henry manufactured grievances at industrial scale when Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, fled England in 1164 after his shattering quarrel with Henry over the rights of the Church. It was Louis who sheltered him, funded him, and walked beside him for 6 years, extracting from the affair an ocean of prestige as protector of God's Church against a tyrant. And when Henry's knights finally butchered Becket at his own altar in Canterbury Cathedral in December of 1170, the murder splashed permanent stain across the Plantagenet name in every court in Christendom. Louis had spent 6 years positioning himself on the right side of the most famous crime of the century, and he had done it without drawing a sword. The second weapon was Henry's family, and Henry sharpened it for him. The Plantagenet Empire was a personal conglomerate, held together by one man's energy, and that man had 4 legitimate sons, each one hungry, proud, entitled. Henry crowned his eldest boy as junior king of England, borrowing the old Capetian trick, then gave him no actual power and no money. He made Richard Duke of Aquitaine and Geoffrey Duke of Brittany on the same terms. Grand names over empty hands. The sons seethed. Their mother seethed with them. Eleanor, pushed aside by Henry's open affair with a mistress he flaunted, had removed herself to Poitiers and taken up the government of her own duchy, and her sons kept arriving there, angry. In 1173 the family detonated. The young king slipped away from his father's court by night and rode straight to Paris. To the man, every rebellious Plantagenet instinctively ran to. His father-in-law, Louis, Richard and Geoffrey followed. Eleanor tried to follow too, and was caught on the road. By some accounts, dressed as a man, and spent the next 16 years as her husband's prisoner, moved from castle to castle in England while her sons made war. The revolt that followed spread across the whole empire, from Scotland to Poitou, an alliance of the sons, the King of France, the Count of Flanders, and the King of Scots against one middle-aged man. The middle-aged man beat them all. Henry moved with his usual impossible speed, crushed the risings one by one, captured the King of Scots, and forgave his sons because he needed heirs. It looked like total victory. Louis absorbed the defeat the way he absorbed everything, quietly, and drew the lesson that mattered. The empire could not be beaten from outside. It could be made to eat itself, and its own princes would supply the teeth. Through all these years, the French succession hung on a nursery that stayed silent, and the whole of Europe watched it. Louis had 2 daughters by Eleanor, 2 more by his second wife, who died giving birth to the second. 4 girls, no boy, and the king was past 40, if he died sonless. The crown's continuity trick, unbroken since Hugh Capet, failed at last, and the wolves were already circling the succession. Then, on an August night in 1165, his third wife, Adela of Champagne, went into labour in Paris, and the city sat up waiting. A student from Wales, lodging near the river, wrote down what happened next, because the noise woke him. Bells, first one church and then all of them, and torches in the streets, and a roar of crowds in the summer dark. When he leaned out and asked what was happening, 2 old women ran past, shouting that God had given the kingdom an heir. The baby was a boy. His father named him Philip, and Paris, on its own, named him Dieudonné, given by God. Louis VII spent his last years arranging the handover with the care of a man who had waited his whole reign for the chance. In 1179, with his own health failing after a stroke, he had the 14-year-old crowned at Reims, the junior king beside the old, exactly as Hugh Capet had crowned Robert almost 2 centuries before. It was the 7th time the family had run the ritual. Every eldest son, since 987, had received the crown while his father lived. Insurance renewed generation after generation against the election no one now remembered. It was also the last time. The boy crowned that day would never repeat the ceremony for his own son, and no king of France would ever perform it again. The habit ended because the need ended. By the next generation, the idea that the crown of France passed automatically from father to son had hardened into something no assembly could touch, and the insurance policy of Hugh Capet was quietly allowed to lapse, paid up in full. You can date the moment this dynasty stopped being provisional by the ritual it finally felt safe enough to drop. Louis died the following year, in September of 1180, and was buried not at Saint-Denis with his ancestors, but at a Cistercian abbey he had founded. Plain to the end, he had lost Aquitaine, lost his first queen to his greatest rival. lost every war that could be counted. He left his son a kingdom still wrapped on three sides by Plantagenet land. He also left him a crown untouched in prestige, a church that owed the Capetians everything, a capital growing rich, and a rival empire seeded with furious princes. The monk had not beaten Henry Plantagenet. He had outlasted the need to, and handed the fight to a boy the age would come to call the God-given. The new reign began with the king lost in a forest. In the summer before his coronation, the 14-year-old Philip rode out with a hunting party near Compiègne, chased a boar too far, and lost the hunt, the hounds, and the road. He spent the night alone in the woods, a frightened teenager on a blown horse, and was found the next day by a charcoal burner who led him out. The boy promptly fell dangerously ill, badly enough that his dying father made a pilgrimage across the Channel to pray at Becket's new shrine at Canterbury for the boy's recovery. The old king, begging a favour from the saint his own rival had made, Philip recovered. The story went around that the sickness and the fear had burned something out of him, and whether or not the diagnosis is fair, the man who emerged from that adolescence was notably short on recklessness. He would gamble rarely, hedge always, and wait better than any king of his age. He needed every ounce of it, because at 15 he was a minor, surrounded by adults who intended to own him. His mother's family, the 4 ambitious brothers of the House of Champagne, expected to govern through their nephew. Against them stood the Count of Flanders, the richest prince of the north, who had manoeuvred himself into the role of the young king's patron and meant to collect on it. Each faction pressed in, and the teenager did the thing that became his signature. He took a wife from the Flanders side, a 10-year-old bride named Isabel of Hainault, who brought the county of Artois as her dowry. And the moment the Champagne uncles overreached, he broke with them publicly, seized his mother's dower lands, and faced down the family revolt that followed. Then, when Flanders presumed too far in turn, he broke with Flanders too, fought the Count to a standstill, and emerged from the war holding Artois and more besides. By 18 he had shed both sets of handlers and ruled alone. The lords who had planned to manage the orphan discovered, several treaties too late, that the orphan had been managing them. The strangest patron of his minority was the one who should have been his destroyer, Henry Plantagenet, who could have shredded a divided France led by a sick teenager. Instead, propped the boy up, mediated his quarrels, and repeatedly declined to press his advantage. The choice was not sentimental. A weak Capetian on the throne suited Henry exactly as a weak crown had always suited the great princes, and a France in chaos might deliver the boy into the hands of Flanders or Champagne, either of which would be worse. So the old lion guarded the cub, and the cub took careful notes on the technique. What Philip understood, earlier than anyone around him, was the arithmetic of his position. Contemporaries guessed at the revenues, and modern historians confirm the shape of the guess. The Plantagenet lands out earned the French crown by multiples. In a straight war, France lost. Every advisor could see that far. Philip saw one step further. The empire's strength was one man's lifespan, and its weakness was that man's sons, and the sons were a renewable resource. His father had discovered the weapon by accident, playing host to Plantagenet rebels as they wandered in. Philip industrialized it, Paris, under the young king, became a standing reception hall for Angevin family grievances, and he worked each new guest with a warmth his cold nature never showed anywhere else. The young King of England, Henry's crowned and powerless heir, died of dysentery in 1183, mid-rebellion against his father. Geoffrey of Brittany came to Paris next, plotting something with Philip that death interrupted. Trampled in a tournament melee in 1186, Philip staged extravagant grief, and some said he had to be restrained from throwing himself into the grave. Perhaps it was even real. The friendships were tools, and the tools kept breaking. But the supply held, because there was always another Plantagenet's son, and the last two were the best of all. Richard, now the eldest living, the finest soldier in Europe, and John, the youngest, the father's darling. Philip took up Richard the way a craftsman takes up a chisel. The two princes rode together, dined from one dish, and, the chronicle says, slept in one chamber in the way of honoured companions, while Philip poured poison in exact doses. Your father crowned your dead brother. He will not crown you. He keeps your inheritance loose so he can slide it to John. Watch what he does, not what he says. The whispers worked because they were true. Henry really was hedging toward John, and everyone could see it except Henry. In 1188, the last act began. Philip and Richard appeared together, allied, in open war against the old king. Henry, past 50 now, and sick, fought his son's generation with his old speed for one more year. And the year broke him. In the summer of 1189, with his birthplace of Le Mans burned behind him and his barons deserting daily, he met Philip and Richard at a parley near Tours and accepted every term they dictated. One term was a list. The king asked to see the names of the men who had secretly sworn against him, and the clerk began to read, and the first name on the list was John, the son he had guarded his whole life. The son the whole war had been fought to enrich, had joined the winning side in the final weeks. Henry turned his face away and stopped defending himself against anything, and 2 days later, at Chinon, he died. Servants looted the death chamber down to the bedclothes. His bastard son Geoffrey, the only child at his side, covered the body with a cloak. The empire that could not be beaten from outside had been eaten from within, precisely on schedule, and the man who set the table was 23 years old. What Philip could not do was stop the empire from passing whole to a better soldier than himself. Richard was crowned at Westminster that September, and almost immediately the two former companions found themselves yoked together in an enterprise. Neither could escape. Jerusalem had fallen to Saladin in 1187, and all Christendom was sworn to the rescue. The kings of France and England took the cross together, because neither dared leave home while the other stayed, and rode east in 1190 in a state of smiling, mutual surveillance that curdled, mile by mile, into open hatred. In Sicily they quarrelled over money and Richard's discarded engagement to Philip's own sister. At the siege of Acre in the Holy Land they quarrelled over precedence, over the spoils, over everything, while the city starved between them. Acre fell in July 1191, and within weeks Philip announced that his health was broken and he was going home. The camp said plainly that he was deserting the crusade, and the shame of it followed him for years. He sailed anyway, because he had run the numbers that mattered to him. Every month Richard spent being a hero in Palestine was a month Normandy stood open. Philip had sworn on holy relics not to touch Richard's lands while the crusade lasted, and he began breaking the oath almost before his ship cleared the harbour. Then fortune handed him a gift beyond calculation. Richard, sailing home in disguise in December 1192, was recognized near Vienna and seized by the Duke of Austria, whom he had mortally insulted at Acre, and sold upward to the German Emperor, who priced the King of England at 150,000 marks, a ransom that would swallow years of English revenue. The news reached Paris like a jackpot bell. For 14 months, the greatest soldier in Europe sat in imperial custody while Philip and John, the traitor brother, worked in open partnership. Philip bit into the Norman border fortresses. John promised away whatever Philip wanted in exchange for backing his coup at home. Both men wrote the emperor increasingly frank offers of cash to keep the prisoner locked up just a little longer. England, led by Richard's Iron Mother, the old queen, Eleanor herself, taxed itself to the bone and paid the ransom. In early 1194, the emperor took the money and let his prisoner go, and someone in the French orbit sent John a warning that the chroniclers preserved because it was too perfect to lose. Look to yourself. The devil is loose. Richard came home, forgave John with contempt, crossed to Normandy, and went to war with France. For the next 5 years he beat Philip in the field, methodically, retaking in months most of what had taken years to steal, and Philip returned to the discipline he had learned at 15. Absorb the losses, sign the truces, break them when convenient, keep the archive of grievances current, and wait for the better soldier to run out of luck. On the crusade, and in the captivity, and in every year of this grinding border war, Philip had learned the shape of his enemy down to the joints. He knew which Norman lords could be bought and had receipts for several. He knew where the border defences were stone and where they were paper. And he knew one more thing, the oldest lesson his family owned. The Plantagenets were mortal, and their sons were few now, and the next one in line was John. On the 3rd of July, 1194, near a village called Fréteval, between Chartres and Vendôme, the King of France lost the government of his kingdom in about an hour. Philip was withdrawing north with his army, and Richard, who had been shadowing him for days, chose his moment and hit the marching column from the flank. It was not a great battle. It was a highway robbery performed by several thousand cavalry. Philip himself escaped, by one account because he turned aside into a village church to hear mass, while the pursuit thundered past, hunting a king who was kneeling out of sight behind them. What did not escape was the baggage train. Richard's men took the horses, the tents, the money chest, the royal seals, and something whose loss no one had ever planned for, because until that afternoon no one had quite realized it could be lost. The archive of France was in the wagons. Charters, treaties, tax records, the lists of who owed what and who held which land on which terms, the accumulated paper memory of the crown, all of it travelled with the king wherever he rode, as it had under his father and his father's father, because the government of France was wherever the king happened to be standing. Now it was in enemy hands, or scattered in the summer mud of a road in the Vendomois. In a single ambush, the Capetian monarchy lost its receipts. A lord could now walk into a royal audience and claim his family had always held a certain privilege, always been exempt from a certain payment, and the king had nothing to check the story against. and both men would know it. You can learn everything about Philip from what he did next. He did not fight a battle to get the wagons back. He went home and started writing. Clerks were set to reconstructing the lost records from copies held in monasteries, from the memories of old officials, from the other party's version of every deal. And when the reconstruction was underway, Philip made the decision that outlasted every castle he ever took. The documents would not travel anymore. The archive would live in Paris, in a fixed and guarded place, and the king would come and go while the papers stayed put. The collection that began as a response to one bad afternoon at Fréteval grew into the Trésor des Chartes, the treasury of charters, and it became the memory of the French state, kept continuously from that day forward. France still has it. The national archives of the French Republic descend from the filing cabinet Philip built because Richard robbed him, which makes that ambush one of the most productive defeats in the history of government. The archive was one organ of a body that was growing all through these years, mostly out of sight of the chronicles, which preferred sieges, to see it follow one man on one road. Picture an autumn morning around the turn of that century, and a rider coming into a small Norman market town with 2 clerks behind him and a ledger in his saddlebag. He is the bailli, the king's new kind of officer. The town has dealt with royal agents before, the old provosts, men who bought their offices at auction and squeezed the district to recover the price. And everyone understands how that game works. This man plays a different one. He did not buy his post. He is paid a salary from Paris, and he can be dismissed from Paris, and next year, or the year after, he will be rotated to another district entirely. He is forbidden to buy land where he serves. He is forbidden to marry where he serves. He cannot even lodge too long in the same lord's house, in case the hospitality turns into a debt. He holds court in the market square, hears the assize, collects what the register says is owed, and writes down what he collected. And 3 times a year he rides to Paris and stands in front of the king's accountants while they check his book against their own. Multiply that rider by a few dozen, and you have the invention. It was not a bureaucracy in the way a later age would build them. It was a small core of literate, loyal, interchangeable men with account books, riding circuits through the royal lands. It was also something no king of France had ever possessed. A government that could see, for the first time, a Capetian knew, roughly and in writing, what he owned, what it yielded, what it cost, and which of his officers was lying to him. His grandfather had governed by memory and personal presence. Philip could be in one place and know what was happening in another, because the paper moved even when he did not. The crown's ordinary revenue roughly doubled across his reign even before his great conquests. Squeezed out of better collection, growing towns, tolls, and the profits of justice, and out of repeated, cynical exactions from the Jewish communities of the domain, whom Philip expelled early in his reign, readmitted for a price, and taxed hard thereafter. The wealth-bought soldiers who served for pay rather than for 40 days of feudal obligation, and engineers and stone. War was becoming a matter of sustained finance, of who could keep an army standing through a winter, and a king with registers was discovering that he could outlast lords who still ran their wars out of a strongbox. All of it, the archive, the bailiffs, the doubled revenue, was insurance against a fact Philip lived with every day. In the field, against Richard, he still lost. The last years of the century were a rhythm of French sieges, answered by Richard's counterstrokes, punctuated by truces neither side meant. Then, in the spring of 1199, during one such truce, Richard rode south to settle accounts with a minor rebel lord in the Limousin, at a castle called Chalus, a place so unimportant that the siege was almost recreational. In the evening light, he walked the perimeter without his mail shirt, applauding the aim of a lone crossbowman on the wall who had been amusing the besiegers all day, deflecting bolts with a frying pan. The man loosed at the king, and the bolt sank into Richard's left shoulder. The wound festered. 11 days later, with his ancient mother, Eleanor, summoned to his side, and the crossbowman, by the famous account, pardoned at his deathbed, Richard died at 41, King of England for 10 years, of which he had spent perhaps 6 months in England. The pardoned crossbowman, the story adds, was flayed alive by Richard's captain the moment the king was dead. Mercy, in that empire, had always been a personal possession, and it died with the owner. In Paris, Philip absorbed the news that changed the mathematics of his entire life. The soldier he could not beat was gone, the Plantagenet lands, the oaths in his archive, the defected barons on his payroll, the whole patient file he had built for 20 years, now stood against a new adversary. The last of Eleanor's sons, the man who had sold his own father in the final week and his own brother to a foreign prison. Philip had studied John at close range, as an ally, which is the best seat for studying a man's defects. He began, almost at once, to prepare a lawsuit. The weapon that finally cracked the Plantagenet Empire was not a siege engine. It was a summons, written by clerks, sealed in Paris, and served in the spring of 1202 on the King of England, commanding him to appear in person before the court of his lord, the King of France, to answer charges brought by his own vassals. Here is how a lawsuit came to do what 40 years of war could not. John had begun his reign needing peace, and in 1200 he bought one. By the treaty sealed at Le Goulet, Philip recognized John as lawful heir to the whole continental inheritance, and in exchange John conceded border territories, abandoned old allies, and agreed to pay Philip 20,000 marks as a relief. The feudal fee an heir paid his lord for succession to a fief. Richard would have laughed the demand out of the room, and that is precisely the point. The payment put in writing, with John's own seal attached, that the King of England held his French lands as a vassal by grace of the court of France. Philip, the man who kept registers, now had the confession on file. Contemporaries noticed the surrender inside the diplomacy, and John collected a new nickname to set beside the old ones. Soft's-word. The same summer, John handed Philip the pretext, and he did it for love, or appetite, which in John ran together. Touring his southern lands, he saw Isabella of Angoulême, the young heiress of a strategically vital county, and decided to marry her more or less on sight. She was perhaps 12 years old. She was also formally betrothed to Hugh of Lusignan, head of a powerful and prickly clan of Poitevin lords, and in that world a betrothal was close to a contract of state. John married her anyway, in August of 1200. Then, having robbed the Lusignans of their heiress, he proceeded to bully them on every other front as well, confiscating, harassing, daring them to do something about it. They did the one thing his father's generation would never have dreamed of. They did not rebel. Not at first. They appealed. As vassals of the Duke of Aquitaine, they took their grievance over the Duke's head, to the Duke's own lord, the King of France, and asked for justice in his court. Philip had spent 20 years building his standing for exactly this moment. The moment when the machinery of feudal law, which had always run downhill from the king in theory, could be made to run in practice against the mightiest vassal alive. He summoned John to Paris. Every step now followed with the logic of a trap built by a man who had read the rule-book more carefully than anyone playing the game. John stalled, negotiated, demanded safe conducts, and did not appear. He could not appear. A king of England kneeling in a Paris courtroom to answer for his conduct was an unsurvivable picture. And skipping the hearing was a confession of contempt. In April of 1202, the court of France delivered its judgment. John, as a defaulting vassal, was condemned, and all the lands he held of the French crown, Aquitaine, Poitou, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, Normandy itself, were declared forfeit, legally returned to the lord who had granted them on parchment. The Plantagenet Empire in France ceased to exist that day, by due process. Before a single soldier moved. Then the soldiers moved. Philip knighted Arthur of Brittany, the teenage son of the dead Prince Geoffrey, John's nephew, and the alternative heir the Bretons and Poitvins preferred. He betrothed the boy to his own small daughter, invested him with the confiscated fiefs except Normandy, which Philip pointedly kept for the crown, and launched him south with an army, while Philip himself struck into Normandy from the east. The war opened as a rout in slow motion. And then, for 1 week, John turned brilliant. Arthur's army had cornered the old Queen Eleanor, John's mother, nearly 80 now, and still the most formidable politician in the family. In the castle of Mirabeau, John, who was at Le Mans, covered the 80 miles to Mirabeau in about 48 hours, fell on the besiegers at dawn while they breakfasted, and captured the entire enterprise. Arthur, the Lusignans, more than 200 knights. In one stroke, it was his father's speed, his brother's luck, the whole family inheritance flashing out once. And it was the last unambiguously victorious week of John's life. What he did with the victory destroyed him. The prisoners of Mirabeau were starved and brutalized in John's castles until the scandal of it detached his own supporters. And Arthur, 16 years old, a knight, a count, the grandson of Henry Plantagenet, was moved to Rouen in the spring of 1203 and never seen again. What happened in that castle cannot be proven and never could be. What circulated at the time, recorded soberly enough that historians take it as close to the event, was that John killed the boy himself, drunk after dinner, with his own hand or by his direct order, and that the weighted body went into the Seine. Philip demanded Arthur be produced. John could not produce him. No trial, no verdict, no display of the prisoner alive, just a silence out of Rouen that answered every question in the worst possible way. The silence conquered Normandy faster than the army did. The Norman baronage had watched John default on the court of France, lose the paper war, and now, apparently, murder his own nephew and ward. A crime that dissolved every bond of lordship, a medieval mind recognized. Philip's registers had long recorded which Norman lords could be bought. Now they came unbought, castle by castle, house by house, making terms, while terms were still worth making. John, holed up in Rouen through that year, grew suspicious of everyone, trusted no garrison, moved constantly. In December of 1203 he took ship for England, leaving Normandy to defend itself. His officers were told help would come. The Normans watched the sail go down the horizon and drew the accurate conclusion. One thing still stood between Philip and the duchy, and it was the last and greatest work of the brother, on a loop of the Seine, on a chalk cliff 300 feet above the river. Richard had spent the final years of his life and a fortune that staggered his own treasury building, Château Gaillard, the saucy castle, the state-of-the-art of European fortification compressed onto one rock, concentric walls, a fortified island in the river below, outworks, ditches cut into living chalk. Richard had loved it like a child, called it his one-year-old daughter when it rose in a single building season, and boasted, in the version the chroniclers preserved, that he could hold it though its walls were made of butter. As long as Gaillard stood, Rouen could not be approached, and Normandy had an anchor. Philip settled in front of it in August of 1203, and announced by his conduct that he had learned the true lesson of his age, that great fortresses fell to arithmetic, not to courage. He built a double ditch and palisade around the whole position, walling the besiegers in against relief, put up shelters for a winter camp, and began to starve the rock methodically. The garrison commander, Roger de Lacy, was a hard professional, and, as supplies tightened, he made a professional's decision. The hundreds of civilians who had fled into the fortress from the town below, old men, women, children, useless mouths in the cold vocabulary of siegecraft, were put out of the gates to save food for the fighting men. The first groups Philip let pass through his lines. Then, to press the garrison, he closed the cordon, and the next wave of expelled civilians was caught between the castle walls and the French palisade, in the winter ditch. Admitted by neither side, they stayed there for weeks, starving in the open, eating grass, dying in sight of both armies, until Philip, arriving in person, was moved or shamed into letting the survivors crawl out and fed them. Several hundred had gone into that ditch. A fraction came out. The fall of the Plantagenet Empire has a romantic shape from a distance. The lion's inheritance undone by the fox. Up close, at the bottom of the ditch at Gaillard, it looked like what it was. The end came by the latrines. In late February of 1204, after the outer works had fallen to mining and assault, a party of French soldiers found their way into the second enclosure through an unbarred chapel window connected, by the account that stuck, to a garderobe chute, the drain of the castle's toilets, and opened the way for their comrades. The inner citadel followed within days. On the 6th of March, 1204, de Lacy and the last 140 starving defenders surrendered the impregnable castle and were treated, professional to professional, with honour. Richard's daughter had held out 6 months against the method Richard himself had always feared, a rich enemy who declined to go home. After Gaillard, the duchy folded like a tent. That spring the town surrendered in sequence as Philip's army walked the roads. Argentan, Falaise, Caen, almost nowhere offering a fight, each negotiating the confirmation of its liberties from the new lord. And on the 1st of April, in the abbey at Fontevraud, Eleanor of Aquitaine died at about 82, Queen of France, Queen of England, mother of 2 kings, prisoner of 16 years. The woman whose wedding had built the empire now dissolving, and she was spared the last scene by a few weeks. On the 24th of June, 1204, Rouen opened its gates, and Normandy, the land of Rollo the Viking and William the Conqueror, the duchy that had humiliated 3 centuries of Capetians and conquered England itself, passed to the King of France. It had taken Philip 2 campaigning seasons. It had taken the preparation of 25 years. There was no triumph staged in Paris, or none that any chronicle bothered to record, and the omission fits the man. Philip did not ride through Rouen scattering coins. He sent in the bay. Within months the registers were absorbing Normandy's revenues, the richest and best administered territory in France, into the crown's accounts. The royal income multiplied, and the little corridor kingdom of Hugh Capet, for the first time in its history, outweighed every vassal it possessed. All of them combined. Across the water, John kept the title of Duke and set about proving that the loss was temporary. England would be squeezed as no kingdom in Europe had ever been squeezed. By taxes, by fines, by confiscations, by the sale of justice itself, until the money existed to buy the largest coalition of princes the age had seen and come back for everything. The recovery was inevitable. John told his court, and, in the flat accounting of silver, actually banked. This, once he was as good as his word, the reckoning would come on a Sunday, in Flanders, in the summer heat, 10 years on. Between 1204 and 1214, the King of England conducted one of the great, sustained extortions of the Middle Ages, and he aimed every penny of it at France. The lost duchy was going to be bought back, and buying it back required allies, and allies required silver, so England paid. John taxed the barons' inheritances at rates his father would have called robbery. He fined men for imaginary offences and sold them pardons for the fines. He took hostages from families he doubted, which by the end was most of them. He auctioned wardships, widows, and justice itself. When the church resisted him over the appointment of an archbishop, he simply seized its revenues, and England spent 6 years under papal interdict. The church doors barred, the bells silent, the dead buried in unconsecrated ground, while the king pocketed the income of the silenced bishops and grew, by the exchequer's own records, richer than any English king before him, in the treasure vaults of his castles, barrel by barrel, the war chest filled. Say this for John, and the chroniclers who hated him said it through their teeth. The plan itself was sound. It was, in fact, his father's kind of plan, patient and financial, and it very nearly worked. The plan looked like this. English silver would assemble a ring of princes around France's northern and eastern flank. The Counts of Flanders and Boulogne, both formerly Philip's men, both now feuding with him, signed on for English pensions. So did a scatter of lords from the Low Countries. And at the top of the bill, the coalition acquired an emperor, Otto of Brunswick, claimant to the German throne, was John's own nephew. And for Otto, breaking Philip meant breaking the ally of his rival in the German Civil War. For John, an emperor gave the enterprise its crown. The strategy was a pincer. John would land in the west of France with an English army, march up through his old family lands, and pull Philip's strength south. Then Otto, Flanders, and Boulogne would come down on Paris from the north, against whatever was left. 2 Yavs, 1 summer, and the verdict of 1204 reversed. In February of 1214, John landed at La Rochelle, and for 4 months the western jaw closed on schedule. Poitevin lords defected to him by the dozen, because Poitevin lords defected to everyone. He took castles, married his daughter into the Lusignan clan he had once robbed of a bride, and in June he pushed north across the Loire into Anjou, the cradle of his house. Philip did exactly what the plan required. He marched south with the royal army to meet the invasion, leaving his son, Prince Louis, 26 years old, to hold the north, and, at a river fortress called La Roche-aux-Moines, the plan met John, Prince Louis, outnumbered by most reckonings, declined to be careful and marched straight at the siege John was conducting. The Poitevin barons in John's army informed him they were not prepared to fight a pitched battle against the son of the King of France, their overlord. And John's nerve went. On the 2nd of July, he broke his camp and retreated so fast that his siege engines and part of his baggage were left standing where they stood. The chronicles reach for the same word English chronicles had used before about John. He fled. The western jaw of the great pincer had come apart at the first firm touch, and the war rode north, which meant everything now depended on the coalition army assembling in Flanders. And that army was magnificent. Otto came down with the German cavalry of his party. The counts of Flanders and Boulogne brought their knights. The English contingent rode under John's half-brother William Longsword, Earl of Salisbury. Around this stele gathered the infantry of the Flemish towns, pikemen and militia from the richest cities of the north. The chroniclers, as chroniclers did, inflated the numbers on both sides into the tens of thousands. Modern estimates run far lower and far closer, perhaps 7,000 men under Philip against 9,000 or so in the coalition, and every man on that field knew which side had the advantage. The coalition's captains knew something else too, and their plan sharpened into a single point. Do not maneuver against the French. Catch them, pin them, and kill or capture the king. Nothing else needed doing. Philip was the whole structure. Remove him. With his heir far away in Poitou, and France reverted to what it had been a lifetime ago, a crown surrounded by wolves, and every wolf at that table had already picked his portion. The armies found each other near Lille in the last week of July, and Philip, seeing the odds, did the sensible thing. He ordered a withdrawal west toward his own fortress line. On the morning of Sunday, the 27th of July, the royal army was strung out in march order, crossing the little river Marque at a bridge by the village of Bouvines. Sunday mattered. The church forbade battle on the Lord's Day, and Philip, a conventionally pious man, seems to have trusted the calendar as a shield. Otto's captains looked at the same calendar and saw the opportunity of the age. An enemy army caught astride a river with its back to a single bridge. The bishop in the coalition council objected to fighting on Sunday. He was overruled by men who had an emperor to make and a kingdom to carve. The coalition wheeled off the road and came on. The French rearguard's riders reached Philip with the news at midday. The accounts that survive describe the king resting by an ash tree near a small church, eating bread soaked in wine. What followed became, for France, the most retold hour of the century. Philip went into the church, prayed briefly, came out, and armed. The trumpets recalled the vanguard, already miles down the road, and the marching column performed the hardest maneuver in medieval war, turning itself about and deploying from line of march into line of battle before the enemy struck it. The oriflamme, the red silk banner of Saint Denis that Louis the Fat had first raised against an emperor 90 years before, went up over the centre. By early afternoon, on the open plain east of the bridge, the thing 60 years of kings had spent whole reigns avoiding was actually happening. Two complete royal armies, kings and emperor, present in person, in a pitched battle that one afternoon would settle entirely. The fighting ran perhaps 3 hours, and 3 moments inside it decided the next century. The first came in the centre, where the Flemish and German infantry ground forward against the French line and reached the king himself. A knot of coalition foot soldiers, men with hooks and long knives, got through the melee to Philip, hooked him by the mail coif, and hauled him off his horse. The King of France went down under enemy hands, in the middle of his own army. His armour turned the blades for the seconds that mattered. A household knight threw himself over the king's body. The banner-bearer waved the royal standard in circles, the signal of last extremity, and the knights of the household crashed into the scrum and cut the king free. Philip remounted. By the span of one mail collar and one loyal body, there was still a France. The second moment came opposite and mirrored it. The French centre, rallying, drove at Otto in his turn. A French knight got close enough to stab at the emperor and killed his horse instead, and the dying animal bolted and carried Otto out of the press. The emperor took the hint the horse had given. He turned and rode for the horizon, leaving his great standard, the imperial eagle over the dragon, to be captured and delivered to Philip. The chroniclers on the French side recorded the king's dry verdict on his brother emperor. We will see his face no more today. The imperial jaw of the pincer was running east, and would keep running, in effect, out of history. For Otto's party dissolved in the disgrace, and the rival he had fought became emperor unchallenged. The third moment belonged to the Count of Boulogne, Renaud, once Philip's friend, the most personally formidable of the traitors, who understood exactly what waited for him in a French prison. He fought on with his ring of mercenary pikemen long after the field was lost, the last hard island in the wreck, until his horse was killed and he was pinned beneath it and dug out by his captors. With him into captivity went the Count of Flanders and William Longsword of Salisbury, taken by a bishop who, forbidden as a churchman to shed blood, had reportedly beaten him from his saddle with a mace. The coalition army came apart across the plain. By evening the arithmetic had inverted. The outnumbered French held the field. The emperor was a fugitive, and the cream of the enemy command rode in chains behind the king's banner. France went out of its mind with joy. The accounts of the homecoming read like the description of a new kind of event, which is what it was. Peasants left the harvest to line the roads. Towns hung cloth from the windows, strewed the streets with branches and flowers, and danced. In Paris, the celebrations ran a full week. Bonfires and feasting, and the whole university out in the streets singing. while the captive counts were paraded through the crowds. Renaud of Boulogne displayed chained on a cart. No one watching had ever seen the kingdom celebrate anything together before, because the kingdom had never before done anything together. The victory belonged to the crown, and somehow, therefore, to everyone under it. And men who study the growth of nations have pointed at that week of bonfires ever since, cautiously, as the sort of hour in which a country begins to notice itself. Then the bill crossed the Channel, and this is where the Sunday at Bouvines stops being a French story. John got the news in the west of France, where his half of the war had already failed, and understood the totality of it at once. The coalition was dead. The war chest of 10 years was spent. The recovery of the empire was over. Not postponed. Over. He sailed home in October to an England that had been squeezed for a decade to fund a triumph, and now contained the squeezing without the triumph. Every instrument of the extortion remained in memory. The punitive taxes, the sole justice, the hostages, the interdict years, the fear that had held the lid on, the fear of a king who might yet come home, a conqueror, evaporated on the plain at Bouvines with everything else. Through the winter, the baronial opposition hardened from grievance into organization, from organization into demands, and in the spring of 1215 into open revolt. In May, the rebels did the thing that broke the king's position. They rode into London, and London opened its gates to them on the 15th of June, 1215. In a meadow called Runnymede, beside the Thames west of London. King John met the barons. He could no longer fight, and sealed the Charter of Liberties they put in front of him. Most of its clauses settled the technical grievances of feudal landholders, the exact machinery John had abused. A few clauses reached further, and one reached furthest of all, the promise that no free man would be seized, imprisoned, stripped of his rights, outlawed, or exiled except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. The document acquired its name, in time, Magna Carta, the Great Charter. It failed almost immediately, as the next chapter will show, and it also never died. It was reissued, confirmed, and invoked for 8 centuries, and when English colonists in America rose against their own king 560 years later, the charter sealed at Runnymede stood at the root of the case they made, cited in their assemblies, echoed in their state constitutions, engraved into the amendments of the Constitution they finally wrote. The line from that meadow runs unbroken into American law. Follow the causes back. Though, link by link, the charter was extracted by barons who could defy their king because his power had collapsed. The power collapsed because the coalition and the treasure of a decade were annihilated in an afternoon. The annihilation happened on a Sunday at a bridge in Flanders, at the hands of the King of France. No serious historian would call Bouvines the cause of Magna Carta, and no honest one would leave it out of the chain. One more measure of the day, and it is the quietest one. In 987, an assembly of great lords had handed the crown of France to Hugh Capet because he was the candidate too weak to threaten them. At Bouvines, the descendants of such lords, Flanders and Boulogne, among the greatest names of the realm, staked everything on breaking Hugh Capet's descendant, and failed, and rode to Paris in his chains, 227 years, father to son, from the crown nobody feared, to the crown nobody could afford to fight. In May of 1216, a French fleet stood in to the coast of Kent, and no one stopped it. The French army came ashore and marched on London. At its head rode Louis, the 28-year-old heir of France, the same prince who had faced down John at La Roche-aux-Moines, and he had come, at the written invitation of the barons of England, to be their king. The invitation was the fruit of Runnymede rotting. John had sealed the Great Charter in June and spent the summer unsealing it. By autumn he had letters from the Pope, his new feudal overlord. For in the depths of the interdict crisis, John had performed the century's most cynical masterstroke and surrendered England itself to the papacy, receiving it back as a papal fief. His lord the Pope now obligingly declared the charter null and void, extorted and shameful, and excommunicated the barons who upheld it. The war that followed was John at his most effective and most repulsive, a winter harrying of his own kingdom with foreign mercenaries, burning the rebel north town by town, the barons besieged in London, their charter annulled and their cause excommunicated, needed a king to replace the one they had. And by the logic of the age, they went shopping in the family. Louis of France was married to Blanche of Castile, granddaughter of Henry II, and Eleanor of Aquitaine, niece of John himself, through his wife. The French prince carried Plantagenet blood at one remove, and he came with the one asset the rebels lacked, an army that frightened royal mercenaries. For a season, it simply worked. Louis entered London on the 2nd of June, 1216, through streets decked to receive him, and at St. Paul's Cathedral, before the assembled barons and the mayor, he was proclaimed King of England, with celebration and homage, though never a crowning. The King of Scots came south to do him homage. 2/3 of the English baronage, by the common modern count, stood in his allegiance at the high tide, and the castles of the southeast fell to him through the summer, and John's own household began to leak earls. John himself kept moving, avoiding battle, the one skill that never left him. In October, crossing the tidal flats of the Wash with his baggage train, he misjudged the water. The carts went into the quicksand and the incoming sea, and with them, by the account that entered legend, the royal treasure and the crown jewels, swallowed by the tide. Whatever the exact inventory, the loss was real, and so was the dysentery that took hold of the king that same week. On the night of the 18th of October, 1216, in the castle at Newark, amid a storm, the chroniclers dressed in appropriate omens. John died at 49, and the whole war changed shape in a single stroke of biology. The royalist cause now had a different face, and the face was 9 years old. Henry, John's eldest son, was hurried to Gloucester and crowned with a plain gold circlet. His mother's, some said, since the crown itself lay somewhere under the Wash. The regency around the child was led by William Marshal, past 70 now, the most respected knight alive, and the old man made one move of genius. He reissued Magna Carta. The charter John had died fighting became, within weeks of his death, the founding promise of his son's government, sealed by the regent in the boy king's name. The rebellion's cause had just been adopted by the crown, and every baron in Louis's camp woke to find his war aims achieved by the other side. Fighting to punish John made sense, fighting to disinherit John's blameless child, on behalf of a French prince whose foreign knights grew less charming by the month, made steadily less. The defections turned, then flooded. In May of 1217, half of Louis's army, besieging Lincoln, was caught inside the town by a royalist relief force under the ancient marshal himself, who fought in the streets like a man 40 years younger, and the French cause in the Midlands was crushed in an afternoon. In August, a fleet bringing Louis reinforcements from France, organized by his wife Blanche, who had thrown herself into the war effort with an energy England would hear of again, was intercepted off Sandwich and destroyed. Louis, holding London but little else, read the arithmetic he had been raised on and made terms. By the treaty sealed that September, he gave up his claim, released his adherents, and received 10,000 marks, politely labelled expenses, to go home. A quiet clause of the settlement asked that he be treated as one who had never been king. And England took the invitation with both hands. The proclamation at St. Paul's slid out of the national memory so completely that the 16 months when a Frenchman ruled from London held the homage of the Scots king, and commanded 2/3 of the baronage, became the reign that officially never happened. English school children learn the year 1066. Almost no one learns 12, 16. Louis went home to a father who had carefully financed the adventure while officially deploring it, and waited another 6 years for his own crown. When it came, in 1223, he wore it for only 3 years, but the reign compressed a generation's work into them. He struck south down the Atlantic coast and took Poitou and La Rochelle from the boy King of England, shearing another province off the old Plantagenet inheritance. Then he turned to the far south, where a war of religion had been burning for 15 years. That war needs its minute of honesty, because the lands it delivered became France, and the delivery was terrible. The wide, rich, cultured south, the Languedoc, where the troubadours sang and Eleanor's grandfather had scandalized bishops, had bred a dissident faith the church called the Cathar heresy, rooted so deeply that whole towns and noble houses held it openly. In 1208, a papal legate was murdered on the Rhone, and the Pope summoned a crusade, with all a crusade's privileges and pardons, against Christian territory. The first of its kind, Philip Augustus, cold as ever, had declined to lead it. Northern lords, under the ferocious Simon de Montfort, had waged it for him for a generation, and the wreckage was beyond anything in the northern wars. At Béziers, in the first summer, the crusading army stormed the town and killed the population wholesale, Catholic and Cathar together. Thousands of people, the phrase that history attached to the massacre. Kill them all. God will know his own, was reported later as the legate's answer to a soldier's question. He may never have said it. The pile of dead that prompted the story was real. 20 years of that followed. Zegas, burnings of hundreds of believers at a time, the slow strangling of a civilization's independence. Louis VIII took the cross in 1226 and led the Crusade's final campaign in person, and the resistance of the exhausted South collapsed in front of the royal army, town after town submitting as he came down the Rhone. Within 3 years of his campaign, by treaty, the county of Toulouse was folded toward the crown, its heiress married to a royal brother, its inheritance mortgaged to Paris. The kings of France had gained what the map still shows, the Mediterranean south, and they had gained it as heirs to a war their own chronicles struggled to look at directly. Louis never saw the harvest. Riding north from the crusade in November of 1226, he died of dysentery at a small castle in the Auvergne, aged 39, king for 3 years. The man who had been proclaimed sovereign of England and buried as a crusader of France. His heir was a boy of 12. His widow was a Spanish princess, whom the great barons of France neither feared nor respected. A foreign woman, alone, at the head of a child's kingdom, across the realm, in the castles of princes who remembered better days. The calculation began the same week as the funeral. Every gain since Bouvines was 12 years old and reversible. The machine the Capetians had built had never once been tested without a grown king's hand on it. The widow's name was Blanche of Castile. The barons were about to learn how badly they had misread her. 3 weeks after her husband died in the Auvergne, Blanche of Castile put her 12-year-old son under the holy oil at Rheims, and the speed was the whole message. The funeral cortege of Louis VIII was barely home. The great barons of the realm had expected the decent interval such occasions demanded. Months of mourning and negotiation, during which a regency would be bargained out among the peers, price by price, the way regencies always were. Instead, the summonses went out within days. On the 29th of November, 1226, in the Coronation Cathedral, a slight, fair-haired boy was anointed King of France as Louis IX, and every lord who had stayed away, and many of the greatest had pointedly stayed away, woke to find the game already lost. There was no vacancy to exploit. There was an anointed king, sacred and untouchable, and a mother standing behind him who had just demonstrated that she understood tempo better than any man on the board. The men who intended to break her were the old familiar names of the realm. Peter of Brittany, called Morclerc, clever, restless, and faithless by profession. Hugh of Lusignan, head of the clan that had once triggered the fall of Normandy, now married, in the age's neatest irony, to John's widow, Isabella of Angoulême, the very bride whose theft had started it all. Around them gathered lords who had watched the crown swell for 40 years and saw, in a Spanish widow and a child, the first opening in a generation to cut it back down. Their public claims were dressed in principle. The government of the realm belonged to the peers, and a woman, a foreigner, had usurped it. Their private inventory was simpler: castles, provinces, and the pensions John's son, across the channel, was happy to promise. A chronicler of the day put the case against her in one line that every rebel could have signed. She was a woman, and she was a stranger, and she had no right to rule. What she had was everything her husband's family had built, and she used all of it at once. She had Paris, the treasury, and the registers. She had the church, which had anointed her son and did not intend to see its own sacrament discounted. She had the bailies in the provinces, salaried men whose loyalty ran to the crown that paid them, whoever wore it and whoever stood behind it, and she had learned statecraft in the best school in Europe. For her grandmother was Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had crossed the Pyrenees at nearly 80 to fetch the 12-year-old Blanche personally, and chosen her, of all her granddaughters, for the French marriage. The barons of France had looked at a widow. What was actually facing them was Eleanor's chosen pupil, holding Philip Augustus's machine. The proof came in the first winter, and it came, of all places, at Montlhéry, The rebel lords had planned to seize the young king on the road. The oldest move in the feudal playbook. Own the boy, and you own the government. Warned in time, the royal party took shelter behind the walls of Montlhéry, the same tower that had once strangled the Paris road and made a king of France old before his time. Royal property, now for a century, Blanche sent word to Paris. And Paris came out. The militia of the city, armed townsmen, marched the 15 miles south in ranks, lined the road home, and walked the King of France back to his capital between two hedges of citizens, the crowds calling blessings on him the whole way. Louis never forgot it. Decades later he would describe that road to his friend Joinville. The people crying out to God to give him a good and long life. The lords had reckoned the crown's strength in knights, and by that count the boy was easy prey. They had left out of the count 100 years of safe roads, bat markets, and royal justice, which had quietly turned the richest city in the kingdom into the dynasty's own weapon. The trap failed because the trappers were a century out of date. What followed was 5 years of coalition warfare in which the coalition never once won a season. Blanche moved in winter, when feudal armies preferred their fires, leading the host in person against Morclerc's castles with the young king riding at her side to make every campaign a crusade of loyalty. She spent money where fighting was expensive and bought where lords were cheap. And the registers told her exactly who was cheap. She detached the Count of Champagne. Thibaut, the poet count, a songwriter of European reputation, who abandoned his fellow rebels for her side and stayed bought. The court gossips explained his loyalty with verses and whispers about his devotion to the Queen. And the whispers cost her nothing and cost the rebellion Champagne. When Henry III of England finally landed in Brittany in 1230 with the invasion the rebels had sold him, he marched his army in a stately, expensive circle for some months, besieged nothing of consequence, ran short of money, and sailed home. Morcler submitted. The Lusignans made terms. By 1234 the rebellion of the peers of France was simply over, extinguished without one pitched battle, and the woman who had extinguished it handed her son, on his majority, a kingdom larger and quieter than the one his father had left. One acquisition of the regency outweighed even the victories. In 1229, Blanche closed the Southern War. Her husband had died, returning from, by the treaty sealed in Paris that April, Raymond VII, the exhausted Count of Toulouse, kept his title for his lifetime and yielded the future entire. His only child, his daughter Joan, would marry one of Blanche's younger sons, and the whole vast inheritance of Toulouse would pass with her to the royal family. The wide south that no Capetian writ had ever truly reached, the land of the troubadours and the burned believers, was signed over to Paris in a marriage contract. 1 generation deferred. The crown had learned to conquer with a wedding, the same instrument that had once cost it Aquitaine. And this time the instrument was pointed outward. Measure the regency against everything this story has crossed, and its size comes clear. Child successions were where medieval dynasties went to die. A boy king had cost the Carolingians their grip. Child heirs had shattered Normandy, torn Anjou, and invited every wolf in every forest for 400 years. The Capetians had dodged the test for 2.5 centuries by the simple luck of grown sons, and in 1226 the luck finally ran out. The classic trap sprang. Minor heir, foreign mother, baronial league, foreign invasion, all four horsemen of a medieval succession crisis arriving together, and the machine did not even slow down. The bailies collected, the courts sat, Paris armed for its king. The crown that had once been nothing but a man on a horse had become a system, and the system had just proven it could run on a widow and a child. Blanche remained a power in the realm until she died, regent again in her son's absence, formidable to the end. And her real monument was the son himself. She had raised him with a fierceness the court never forgot, teaching him, by his own account, that she would rather see him dead at her feet than guilty of one mortal sin. Europe would spend the next 40 years discovering exactly what kind of king that sentence produces. There was an oak tree in the woods at Vincennes, east of Paris, and in summer, after hearing Mass, the King of France would come out and sit at the foot of it, on a carpet, with his household standing by. Anyone could approach. That was the whole institution. A peasant with a grievance, a widow cheated of her dower, a knight in a boundary quarrel. Any of them could walk up under the branches and put their case to the King of France directly. He would hear it there on the grass, intimate, or point them to the councillors seated around him, asking, by the account of a man who watched it happen, "Is there anyone here with a case? Let him come forward." The man who watched was Jean de Joinville, a young lord of Champagne, who became the king's close friend, followed him on crusade, and wrote, in his old age, a memoir of Louis IX, so plain-spoken and so full of remembered conversation that the king walks off its pages alive. It is from Joinville that the oak tree comes, and the carpet, and the summer garden at Paris, where the king sat on the same terms. And history should be honest about what the picture is. It is one loyal friend's memory, written 60 years later, of the man he loved most. The oak became the single most famous image of French kingship, painted and retold for 7 centuries, precisely because France wanted it to be true, but stripped the varnish and checked the records. And the strange thing is, how much survives the checking? The charters, the court rolls, and the ordinances of the reign all show the same thing the old man remembered. Under Louis IX, the Crown of France went into the justice business on a scale no one had ever attempted. And people came. Ask the practical question, because the practical question is the one that built France. Why would anyone bring a lawsuit to the king? For 4 centuries the answer had been that nobody did. Justice was local. Your lord judged you, or his lord judged him. In courts that settled matters the old ways, by oath, by ordeal, and above all, by the judicial duel, trial by combat, in which God was presumed to strengthen the arm of the honest man. And the party with the better champion therefore tended to be remarkably honest. The king's court was far away, and it was for the king's own tenants, and it had nothing you wanted. Louis changed every term of that answer, and he did it with written rules. Around 1258, an ordinance abolished the judicial duel in the courts of the royal domain. In the king's courts, from now on, a dispute would be settled by inquest, by testimony, by documents, by witnesses examined under oath. A lawsuit stopped being a fight and became an investigation. Feel the pull that exerted across the kingdom, if your case was strong and your sword arm weak. If you were a widow, immersion, an abbey, a small knight facing a great one. The royal court was suddenly the only table in France where the cards were not stacked by muscle. The great lords kept the duel in their own courts for a long time, yet their subjects began, in a trickle and then a stream, walking their quarrels to the king's judges instead. And every case that walked was a quiet transfer of authority from the castle to the crown. Royal jurisdiction spread not by decree, but by customer preference, appeal by appeal. And the king's council sitting in judgment at Paris grew so busy that it was hardening. By the end of the reign, into a standing professional court, with a name that would echo for 500 years. The Parliament. Then Louis did the thing that had no precedent anywhere. In 1247, he commissioned teams of investigators, enquêteurs, mostly friars, men with no lands and no local stake, and sent them riding through the royal domains with an open mandate. They were to receive complaints, and the complaints they were to receive were complaints against the king's own government, against the bailies, against the provosts and sergeants and foresters, against the whole salaried machine his grandfather had built. Anyone wronged by a royal officer could testify, and the friars wrote it all down. And the rolls of their inquests survive today by the thousand. Page after page of ordinary voices. A woman whose vineyard, a provost, seized, a village charged twice for the same toll, and the crown paid restitution, and officers were dismissed. Kings had audited their money since accounting began. Louis was auditing his state's behavior, at his own initiative, against his own interest, because he believed God would hold him answerable for every act done in his name, whatever the belief's source. Its effect was measurable, and subjects measured it. A government that would punish its own agents was a government you could risk trusting, and trust, gathered one refunded toll at a time, was becoming the crown's compound interest. The money in men's purses taught the same lesson. France in 1250 was a chaos of currencies, every great lord minting his own, clipping and debasing as his debts required. Louis's ordinances made the royal coinage lawful tender across the entire kingdom, in every lord's lands, while each baron's coin was confined to his own territory. Then the crown did the hard part. It kept the royal coin honest, full weight, sound silver, decade after decade. And the market did the rest. Mercian, given a choice between a coin good everywhere and a coin good locally, chose the king's, and the royal coinage drove the baronial mints slowly toward irrelevance without a single one being outlawed. Long after the king was dead, when money changers across Europe wanted to name a coin of absolute reliability, they spoke of the good money of St. Louis. The reputation compounded across borders, and by mid-reign it had made the King of France into something Europe had never had. A court of appeal for kings. Louis arbitrated between crowns and between princes, between cities and bishops, and in 1264 came the astonishing one, the barons of England, in full constitutional revolt against King Henry III, and King Henry III himself, at war over the very shape of English government, agreed on exactly one thing, that the King of France should judge between them. Both sides submitted the quarrel of another kingdom to Louis's personal award. 60 years earlier, a king of France had needed a courtroom maneuver and a murdered nephew to get jurisdiction over a Plantagenet. Now the Plantagenets and their enemies were volunteering. His award went totally for the English king and against the barons, monarchy being a subject on which Louis had firm views. And the English promptly went back to war. Anyway, the verdict mattered less than the venue. The weak crown of 987 had become, by common European consent, the fairest bench in Christendom. Joinville kept the human scale in view, and his details are worth more than any summary. The king dressed so plainly in his later years that visitors mistook courtiers for the monarch. He fed paupers at his own table daily, and on great feasts served them himself. And Joinville, a nobleman of his time, records his own polite horror at some of it, especially the lepers whose company the king did not avoid. Once, Louis put to him the question that Joinville remembered his whole life. Which would you rather, to be a leper, or to have committed a mortal sin? And Joinville, being honest, said he would rather commit 30 sins than be a leper. And the king took him aside later and told him quietly that he was wrong, that no leprosy was as ugly as sin. Joinville wrote it down, unimproved. His own worldliness and the king's terrible sincerity, side by side. Hold on to that sincerity, because it is the hinge of everything still to come. Every reform in this chapter flowed from it. The duels abolished because false verdicts imperiled souls. The enquêteurs dispatched because a king answers to God for his servants. The honest coin, because debasement was theft. The realm was governed by a man who actually believed, without a grain of performance, every article of the faith of his century, and his century drew no line where a later one would. The same conviction that refunded a widow's toll was equally certain that God had enemies, and that a Christian king was obliged to treat them as his own. The gentlest hands that had ever held the crown of France were about to show what that obligation meant, first in the ledgers at home, then in the sands of Egypt. In August of 1239, on the road south of Sens, people saw a sight nobody had a category for. The King of France was walking barefoot, dressed in a plain tunic, like a penitent, and on his shoulders he carried a wooden case. His brother walked beside him, barefoot too, sharing the weight. Behind them came the court, the bishops, the whole apparatus of the realm, on foot, in silence, at the pace of 2 men carrying something heavy with great care. Inside the case was a circle of woven rushes, and the King of France believed, along with essentially everyone watching, that it was the Crown of Thorns, the actual crown pressed onto the head of Christ at his crucifixion, and that he, Louis, was carrying it on his own, back into his own kingdom. How it came to be on that road is a story about money, and it starts in Constantinople. The Latin emperors who had ruled that city since the Fourth Crusade knocked it loose were, by the 1230s, spectacularly broke, reduced to stripping lead from palace roofs. The young emperor, Baldwin II, toured the courts of Europe, begging for funds. The relic collection of Constantinople, the greatest in Christendom, was his last real asset, and the Crown of Thorns was its centerpiece, and by 1238 it had been pawned to Venetian creditors for a mountain of silver. Louis and his mother saw the opening and moved. French envoys paid out the pawn, and the price the records preserve. 135,000 livres, sat somewhere near half the crown of France's ordinary annual revenue, for a single object. The envoys brought it west by sea and land, and Louis met it near Sens, verified the seals of the Byzantine barons, and took off his shoes. More relics followed over the next few years as Baldwin's debts matured. A piece of the true cross, the sponge, the lance head, until Paris held the core of Constantinople's sacred treasury. And, to house what he had gathered, Louis built the box. And the box turned out to be one of the supreme buildings of the human race. The Sainte-Chapelle went up inside the royal palace on the island in the Seine, steps from the king's own chambers, and it went up fast. Finished and consecrated by April of 1248, 7 years or so, from start to sanctification, a speed cathedral builders could only envy. It is 2 chapels stacked. The lower one, for the palace staff, is solid, low, and handsome. Then you climb a spiral stair into the upper chapel, the king's own, and the architecture performs its trick. Because there are no walls, there is a stone cage of slender piers, and between the piers, glass, 50-foot windows of it, wrapping the whole room. More than 600 square meters of stained glass in reds and blues, so deep that on a bright day the entire chamber ignites, and visitors stand in the middle of what several centuries of them have described the same way. The inside of a jewel. Over 1,000 scenes run through those windows. The whole of Scripture, from the creation to the end of the world. And the story lands in the final window, on the relics themselves, arriving in Paris, carried by a barefoot king. The building is a reliquary turned inside out. A shrine. You stand inside. Scripture as weather. Total recorded cost, around 40,000 livres. The Thorns had cost more than 3 times the architecture. Louis would have considered that ratio exactly correct. Now read the politics of it. Because everyone at the time could, for 4 centuries, the kings of France had been kings by the church's oil, junior partners of the sacred, borrowing legitimacy from Reims. This was something new. Jerusalem was in enemy hands. Constantinople was a pawnshop. Rome had prestige, and no relics of the Passion on this scale. Paris now held the Crown of Thorns, purchased, fair, and legal, enshrined in glass at the heart of the royal palace. And the meaning required no sermon. Though France's preachers supplied plenty, Christ had worn one crown, and it now lived with the crown of France. In the king's own house, men began writing that France was the new Holy Land. Its king, the church's eldest son, and the phrase, most Christian king, an old courtesy, started hardening into a title this one dynasty owned. Hugh Capet had needed an archbishop's oil to make him plausible. His descendant, 10 generations on, had made the monarchy itself a shrine, and had done it, characteristically for this family, with a purchase instead of a sword. It was the best money the Capetians ever spent. The city around the chapel was becoming the other half of the argument. Paris at mid-century was among the largest cities in Western Europe, somewhere north of 150,000 people, and climbing, swollen by everything this story has built. The safe roads, the honest coin, the courts, the sheer gravity of the registers. On the left bank, the schools had grown into the university, chartered and privileged by Philip Augustus half a century before. Now, the undisputed capital of Christian thought, 20 nations of students brawling in its streets, in its lecture halls. In exactly these years, a huge, quiet Italian friar named Thomas Aquinas was assembling the framework of Catholic philosophy that the Church runs on to this day. Across the river on the island, the new Cathedral of Notre Dame had been rising for 80 years and was entering its glory. The west towers standing, the great rose windows going in, the flying buttresses spreading. A scholar could hear Aquinas lecture in the morning, cross to see the Crown of Thorns at Sainte-Chapelle, and stand under the towers of Notre Dame by evening, all inside one walk of one afternoon. No other city in Europe offered that afternoon. The little river town Hugh Capet had held, because it was all he really had, was now, by wide consent, the intellectual and sacred capital of the Christian West. 2 footnotes to this chapter still walk around in America, of all places, and they are worth their sentence. The golden lily on the deep blue field, the fleur-de-lis, spread as the badge of this sacred monarchy in exactly these generations, stamped on Louis' coins, painted across the Sainte-Chapelle's ceiling among the stars. It rode to the New World on French ships, and it survives today on the flags of Quebec and Louisiana, stitched in gold on black, on the helmets of the New Orleans saints, whose very name completes the joke. And when French settlers on the Mississippi in 1764 founded a fur trading post and needed a patron for it, they named it for the king in this chapter, which is why the largest metropolitan area in Missouri, the gateway to the west, is called St. Louis. The barefoot man on the Sens Road has a skyline, an arch, and a football team, and has been dead for 7.5 centuries. In the spring of 1248, weeks after his chapel was consecrated, Louis went down to the new port he had built on the Mediterranean and boarded a ship. The most Christian king was going to war for God, and the war would show Europe the other face of everything this chapter has described. 6 years before the barefoot procession, there was another public event in Paris involving sacred books, and it is in the records, too, in June of 1242. By the accounts that survive, carts came to the Place de Grève, the square by the river where the city held its executions, loaded with hand-copied Hebrew manuscripts. This was the Talmud, the vast compilation of Jewish law and commentary that centuries of scholars had built, gathered by royal order from the synagogues and study houses of the kingdom. The count that comes down, from Jewish and Christian sources, both, is somewhere between 20 and 24 cartloads. Thousands of volumes, each one the work of months or years of a copyist's life. In an age when a single book was a substantial piece of property, they were burned in the square, in public, by the same royal government that would carry the Crown of Thorns through Sens the following summer. A rabbi who witnessed it wrote a lament that Jewish communities recite to this day. The road to the fire had run through a courtroom. Of a kind, a Jewish convert to Christianity named Nicholas Donin had laid charges before the Pope that the Talmud contained blasphemies against Christ, and the Pope circulated the charges to the kings of Europe, and one king acted. In 1240, Paris staged what history calls the disputation, a formal trial of the books themselves. 4 rabbis summoned to defend the Talmud before a jury of bishops and masters of the university, with the Queen Mother Blanche presiding at sessions. The rabbis argued with skill inside a proceeding whose verdict, most historians conclude, was never in doubt. The books were condemned, and, after delays and one brief reconsideration, the carts rolled to the Grève. Only France did this. Other kings received the same papal letters and filed them. It happened here because the king here believed, and belief in this reign was policy. Set that beside the oak tree, and do not soften either picture, because the same man made both, and the age saw no contradiction to explain. Louis's justice for his Christian subjects flowed from the same total conviction that made him regard the Talmud as an offense against God, and Jewish money-lending as a sin he was personally implicated in for tolerating. He ordered debts to Jewish lenders cancelled or their profits confiscated, at real cost to his own treasury, which had traditionally taxed those profits. That detail is worth pausing on, because it separates Louis from the ordinary run of medieval kings who squeezed Jewish communities for revenue. His grandfather Philip had treated the Jews of France as a resource, expelling and readmitting them as the accounts required. Louis treated them as a spiritual problem, which was worse, because a resource is at least maintained. In 1269, near the end of his life, came the ordinance requiring Jews of the realm to wear a badge of yellow felt, the ruelle, on breast and back, so that they could be known at sight. The measure descended from a church council decree, and versions existed elsewhere, and it was this royal enforcement that fixed it in French life. 7 centuries later, another government in Paris would order Jews marked with yellow badges, and the 20th century measure needed no explanation to anyone who knew the 13th. Some inheritances run underground for a long time and surface intact. And then there is the Crusade, where conviction met the world, and the world won. The plan was the best informed and best financed of the century. Louis spent 4 years preparing, banked a war chest through taxes on the church, and built from nothing a royal Mediterranean port, Aigis Mortis, whose walls still stand complete today in the salt marshes of the Camargue. The target was Egypt, the treasury and granary of the Muslim world, on the sound theory that Jerusalem would follow wherever Egypt led. In June of 1249, the Armada took the port city of Damietta in the Nile Delta with unexpected ease, the garrison abandoning it in a panic. Then, for 6 months, the crusade sat in Damietta, waiting out the Nile flood. And the waiting was where the campaign began to die. In November, the army marched south along the river toward Cairo. And, in February of 1250, at a town called Mansoura, it destroyed itself in a single morning. The vanguard under the king's brother Robert of Artois got across a ford and caught the Egyptian camp asleep. Then, against every order, Robert charged on into the town itself, into the alleys, where cavalry cannot fight, the Mamluks, the slave soldiers who were the finest fighting men of the age, closed the streets behind him and killed the vanguard almost to a man, Robert included. The Templar contingent, with him losing nearly its whole strength, Louis, coming up with the main army, held the field that day by raw courage and lost the campaign in doing it, because the army was now stranded deep in the delta. Its strength bled, with the river filling behind it, with Egyptian galleys cutting the supply line. Then came dysentery, and scurvy, and famine. Joinville, who lived through every day of it, records the army rotting where it camped, the king refusing to leave sick soldiers behind, and refusing his own escape when it was offered. In April, the wreck of the host began retreating north, and dissolved. Louis, so weakened by dysentery he could barely sit a horse, was captured in a village with the rearguard, and the unthinkable fact went out across 2 continents, the most Christian king the arbiter of Europe, the owner of the Crown of Thorns, was a prisoner in Muslim Egypt. Thousands of his men were massacred in the days after the surrender or sold at auction. Louis himself was held in chains and threatened, and through it, by the testimony of enemies as well as friends. He behaved with a composure that unsettled his captors, negotiating tonelessly while sick nearly to death. The price of the King of France came out at Damietta, returned plus 400,000 livres for the army's ransom, a figure around a full year of royal revenue. And here, the machine this family had built passed its strangest test. The money existed, the credit existed, the sum was assembled, partly on the spot, partly guaranteed. The Templar bankers, after theatrical reluctance, advancing a slice from the very galleys offshore, and the king was redeemed. A century of registers and bailies and honest coin, built up in Paris, ledger by ledger, walked its founder's grandson out of an Egyptian prison. Weakness had many prices. Solvency, it turned out, could pay ransoms. What Louis did next tells you the man's spine. He did not sail home, ashamed to return defeated. He took the remnant of his household to the Crusader coast of Palestine and stayed 4 years, fortifying the port cities with walls that in places still stand, ransoming prisoners batch by batch out of Egypt, doing the unglamorous engineering of survival for the doomed little kingdom, while his mother Blanche ran France as regent, old now and iron to the end. Only her death, in 1252, finally pulled him back. He returned to France in 1254, a changed figure, plainer, harder on himself. The reign of the Enquêteurs and the great ordinances lying mostly in the years after Egypt. A king governing like a man, paying down a debt only he could see. For 16 years he paid it, and then the debt called him east one last time. In 1270, aged 56, against the advice of nearly everyone, Louis took the cross again. The expedition sailed for Tunis, on the North African coast, in July, in full summer, by a piece of strategic logic that historians still argue about. The army had barely entrenched before the camp sickness arrived. Typhus, or dysentery, or both. And it went through the host like fire through August grass. The king's son, John Tristan, born at Damietta, in the depths of the first disaster and named for sorrow, died in the epidemic within weeks. Then the king went down. On the 25th of August, 1270, on a penitent's bed of ashes, with witnesses recording that he was still murmuring the name of Jerusalem, the city he had never seen. Louis IX died outside Tunis, and the crusade dissolved around his body. His bones came home to Saint-Denis by slow stages, working miracles along the road, the report said, and the reports were already the beginning of the next thing, because in 1297, 27 years after the ash bed at Tunis, the church made it official. Pope Boniface VIII, in solemn ceremony, canonized Louis of France, Saint Louis, Confesseur, the only king of France ever raised to the altars. The dynasty of the convenient nobody of 987 now counted a saint of the universal church in its direct male line, and every future king of France would be, by blood, the descendant of a saint, a fact worth entire armies and costing nothing to maintain. The pope who signed the canonization would have his own reasons to regret strengthening that family's halo. The King of France he actually had to deal with was the saint's grandson, and the grandson had inherited the halo, the machine, the lawyers, and the conviction of heaven's mandate, and not one measurable gram of the mercy. In January of 1266, in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, a French prince knelt while cardinals set a crown on his head, and the crown was not the crown of France, it was the crown of Sicily. The man under it was Charles of Anjou, youngest brother of St. Louis, and the coronation announced something Europe had not quite absorbed until it saw the ceremony performed. The House of Capet no longer fit inside its own kingdom. The family had begun to overflow. The overflow was the Pope's own doing. For a generation, the popes had been locked in a death struggle with the Hohenstaufen emperors who ruled Sicily and southern Italy, and having finally destroyed the dynasty in law, they needed a sword to destroy it. In fact, they went shopping in France, because France was where the money, the knights, and the sanctified prestige now lived. Charles took the commission. He was in his late 30s, dur, tireless, and ambitious on a scale that alarmed even his admirers. A man who, in the words of a chronicler, scarcely ever smiled and never wasted an hour. A month after his Roman coronation, he marched south, met the last Hohenstaufen king in battle, and killed him. 2 years later, the final heir of the line, a boy of 16 named Conradin, came over the Alps to reclaim his inheritance. Lost, and was captured, Charles put him on trial and beheaded him in the market square of Naples. A crowned king's grandson, executed on a scaffold like a felon, and Europe flinched. The age understood battlefield death. Judicial killing of royalty was something new, and men remembered who had introduced it. For 15 years Charles built. From Naples he ruled southern Italy and Sicily, pushed garrisons across the Adriatic, bought the crown of Jerusalem outright from a claimant, and aimed the whole apparatus at the ultimate prize, Constantinople itself. By 1282, the youngest son of the quiet Queen Blanche was the most powerful ruler in the Mediterranean world, and a fleet stood ready in Sicilian harbours. Then, on Easter Monday of that year, in front of a church in Palermo, by the account that came down, a French soldier harassed a Sicilian woman, and her countrymen killed him, and the island exploded, the rising spread with the church bells ringing vespers, which gave it the name history keeps, the Sicilian Vespers. Within weeks, the Sicilians had massacred the French garrison population of the island. Thousands of men, women, and children, hunted through the streets by a people who had had enough of Angevin taxes and Angevin contempt. The island offered itself to the King of Aragon, whose wife was the last Hohenstaufen heiress, and Charles spent his final years in a losing war to take it back, and died in 1285 with his empire cut in half. The lesson filed itself in every chancery in Europe. Capetian government travelled, and so did the resentment it could breed. Sicily was the loudest example of a process running in every direction. The brothers and sons of the family were carrying its blood outward through inheritance and marriage, into Flanders and Artois, into Burgundy, and, most consequentially for the deep future, towards Spain. Follow the longest thread and see where it ends. From a younger son of St. Louis descended the House of Bourbon. The Bourbons reached the French throne itself 300 years later. And a Bourbon grandson of Louis XIV took the Spanish crown in 1700, and his direct male descendants have reigned in Madrid, with interruptions, ever since. The kings of Spain today still trace their line, father to son, back to Hugh Capet's election, which makes the house one of the oldest ruling lineages on earth. The direct line in France is heading, in this story, toward a cliff. The family, in the widest sense, never went over it, and that distinction between a line and a house is worth holding on to for the final act. Between the saint and the story's cold, last movement stands one reign, and it belongs to Philip III, the son who came home from Tunis with his father's bones. He was 25 at the accession, and the chroniclers, groping for something to say, called him Philip the Bold, apparently for his skill at arms, and then recorded a king remarkable mostly for obedience, first to his mother, then to his officers, a descent, pious, unremarkable man, administering an inheritance too large for him. The machine ran itself, which was, in fairness, the whole point of a machine, and the machine grew anyway, because the family arithmetic kept compounding. When Philip's uncle Alphonse, Count of Poitiers and, by his wife, Count of Toulouse, died childless in 1271, the whole vast southern package esceted to the crown on schedule. The wedding contract Blanche had written in 1229 paid out 42 years later, and the Kingdom of France reached the Mediterranean in force. No battle required. Patience, in this family, was a form of conquest. Philip's one great independent enterprise was the disaster. After the Vespers, the Pope declared a formal crusade, with full crusade privileges, against Aragon, a Christian kingdom, as punishment for taking Sicily, and offered the Aragonese crown to Philip's younger son. The moral currency of crusading, minted at Jerusalem, was now being spent in a purely political feud between Christian kings, and thinking men across Europe said so at the time. Philip marched in 1285 with one of the largest armies France had ever raised, crossed the Pyrenees, took Girona, and then watched the campaign disintegrate in the oldest way. An epidemic swept the camp. The fleet supplying the army was destroyed at sea. The starving, the sickening host turned back for the mountains, with the king himself burning with fever in a litter. He died in Perpignan in October of 1285, 40 years old, killed by his family's obligations to a brother's ruined empire, riding down out of those same mountains. Beside the litter came the new king of France, and he had been taking notes of his own. He was 17 years old, tall, strikingly handsome, silent, and he had just watched a papal crusade kill his father for nothing. He would remember what the experience taught him about the uses popes made of kings, and one day, when a pope pushed him, all of Europe would find out what conclusions he had drawn. His name was Philip, the fourth of that name, and men called him Le Bel, Philip the Fair. On the 7th of September, 1303, in the hill town of Anagni, southeast of Rome, armed men broke into the private apartments of the Pope, and at their head walked a lawyer. The Pope was Boniface VIII, in his late 70s, the same Pope who had canonized St. Louis 6 years earlier, and he was in Anagni, his hometown, putting the final seal to the most extreme document any pope had ever aimed at a king. It excommunicated Philip IV of France, and it was to be published the following day. The men who came through the doors on the 7th were a mix of the Pope's own Italian enemies, the Colonna family, and agents of the King of France, backed by a hired force that had taken the town at dawn with inside help. The chancelleries of Europe soon heard the details. The papal palace stormed, the cardinals fled through the sewers, and the Pope, when they finally reached him, waiting for them enthroned, robed, crowned with the papal tiara, holding the keys and the cross, daring them to touch the Vicar of Christ. One account, hostile to the French, says a Colonna struck him across the face with an armoured hand. The famous slap of Anagni, the blow, cannot be verified, and historians have argued about it for 7 centuries. What nobody disputes is the rest. The Pope of Rome was held prisoner for 3 days in his own palace by soldiers acting in the interest of the King of France, while they debated dragging him to France to stand trial. The townspeople of Anagni finally rose and drove the raiders out. Boniface, freed, was taken back to Rome, where he collapsed. Within 5 weeks he was dead, of fever and, the age universally believed, of the shock and the shame. Christendom's supreme office had been physically seized by a king's men, and the sky had not fallen, and every ruler in Europe quietly wrote down the result of the experiment. The lawyer leading the raid was named Guillaume de Nogaret, and he is the second most important man in this chapter. So, look at him closely. He came from the south, from the Languedoc, from precisely the country the Albigensian crusade had burned 2 generations earlier, and a persistent tradition, repeated by his enemies and never disproven, held that his own grandfather had been burned as a heretic, whatever the family truth. The man himself was a new species in European politics. He was a professor of Roman law from the University of Montpellier, risen through the royal courts on pure intellectual force, a commoner ennobled by the king's hand, owning nothing but his learning and his loyalty. The barons around the court despised him. The king promoted him past all of them. 2 centuries earlier, a Capetian king had governed through a baker's son in a monk's habit, and the choice had looked eccentric. Now the eccentricity had become the system. The government of France in 1300 was run to a remarkable degree by men like Nogaret, lawyers from the southern universities, trained in the Roman codes that spoke of the sovereign's will as law, men who owed their whole existence to the crown and had therefore no other loyalty to sell. Contemporaries called them the king's knights of the law. They drafted, they argued, they prosecuted, and when the king needed a pope arrested, one of them saddled a horse. The king they served was a portrait no one at the court could read. Philip the Fair was, by every account, the handsomest prince of his age, tall, fair, coldly regal, and almost totally silent. He said little in council, letting his ministers speak, and observers went away arguing about whether the beautiful statue contained a master directing everything or a hollow man run by his lawyers. A hostile bishop sneered that the King of France was the finest-looking bird in the world, and nothing but a bird, an owl that stared and said nothing. The record of the reign reads otherwise. Every policy across 30 years bent toward a single, coherent end, the total sovereignty of the Crown of France over every person, every institution, and every coin inside its borders, pursued through law, without scruple, to the end. Whether the design lived in the king's head or the lawyer's, the kingdom obeyed a design. Money was the engine room of the design. Because the design was expensive, Philip inherited wars. Against England, over Gascony, against the Count of Flanders and his rich weaving cities, and the wars ate silver at a rate no 13th century revenue could feed. In May of 1302, the Flemish problem turned catastrophic. The craftsmen of Bruges rose at dawn and killed the French garrison in their beds. And when the flower of French chivalry rode north to punish the rebellion, the weavers and fullers of the towns met them outside Courtrai on foot, behind ditches, carrying iron pikes and clubs. The French knights charged into the wet ground and the ditches and died there by the hundred, the greatest names of the realm cut down by artisans. And the victors gathered hundreds of pairs of gilded spurs from the corpses and hung them in the church of Our Lady of Courtrai as an offering. The Battle of the Golden Spurs entered Flemish memory forever, and it put the French crown's finances into open crisis, because the disaster had to be avenged, and avenging it 2 years later cost as much again. So the crown went looking for money with the full toolkit of the new lawyers, and the search became a tour of everything that could be squeezed. The coinage came first. The king's mints called in the good silver pennies, the honest money of St. Louis, and reissued them lighter and baser, pocketing the difference, again and again, until prices lurched. Rents collapsed in real value, and riots broke out in Paris, serious enough that the king took refuge for a time inside the fortress of the Temple, a detail to hold on to. Contemporaries did not reach for economic theory. They reached for a name, and called him the counterfeiter king, to his lasting fury and no effect. Then came the church, whose wealth Philip taxed without papal consent, igniting the first great quarrel with Boniface. Then the Lombards, the Italian merchant bankers of the kingdom, arrested, their loans confiscated, their goods sold, and then, in the summer of 1306, the Jews, by secret orders, opened across the kingdom on a single day. The entire Jewish population of France, tens of thousands of people whose families had lived on that soil since Roman times, was arrested at once, stripped of everything, and expelled across the borders with, the records say, the clothes they wore and a day's food, their houses, their goods, their synagogues, and above all, their loan books were absorbed by the treasury, the crown collecting the debts owed to the exiles. At full rigor, for years afterward, St. Louis had ordered Jews marked, his grandson liquidated them as an asset class, with the cold completeness of a man foreclosing a mortgage, and the operation's most chilling feature was its rehearsal value. The crown now knew, in procedural detail, how to arrest an entire category of people across all France in one coordinated day. The file did not stay closed long. The quarrel with Boniface, meanwhile, had escalated into the defining constitutional war of the age, and Philip's government fought it with a weapon no king had ever used: public opinion, deliberately manufactured. When Boniface issued the bull Unam Sanctam in 1302, asserting in the most absolute language the papacy ever produced, that submission to the Roman pontiff was necessary for the salvation of every human creature, kings included, the French answer was not a treatise for scholars. The king's men summoned, for the first time in French history, an assembly of the whole realm, clergy, noble, and, decisively, the towns, packed into Notre-Dame de Paris to hear the king's case against the Pope read out in French, and to endorse it, the Estates General, the institution that would one day, in 1789, detonate the monarchy itself, was born in 1302 as a royal megaphone. Invented so that when France defied Christ's vicar, the defiance would carry the signature of France entire. Nogaret followed with formal charges against Boniface. Read in public assembly, heresy, sorcery, the murder of his predecessor, a poisoned dossier assembled by the standard method of the king's lawyers, which was to make the accusation so enormous that defending against it was itself degrading. Then he rode for Italy, and Anagni followed, and the old pope's heart gave out, and the experiment was complete. What came after Anagni showed the full reach of the result. Boniface's successor reigned 9 months and died. The conclave that followed deadlocked for a year and finally elected, under heavy French influence, a Gascon, the Archbishop of Bordeaux, who took the name Clement V, and who never in his life set foot in Rome, crowned at Lyons with Philip in attendance, kept close by French pressure and his own frailty. Clement settled his court in 1309 at Avignon, on the Rhone, just outside the kingdom's formal border and entirely inside its shadow. The popes stayed there for the better part of 70 years. 7 French popes in succession, in a period Italian writers taught Europe to call the Babylonian captivity of the Church. The phrase has outlived the grievance. The fact underneath it was stark enough without poetry. The office that had crowned emperors and broken kings for 2 centuries now lived next door to France, staffed by Frenchmen, elected under French eyes. And the king in Paris, when he wanted something from the Vicar of Christ, no longer sent ambassadors on a long road. He sent a rider down the Rhone. By 1307, Philip the Fair had subdued or outlived every rival power in his world. The Pope was his neighbour and creature. The nobility was harnessed. The towns were represented and taxed. The Jews were expelled and collected. The coinage was his to debase. One institution remained inside France that answered to none of this: an order of warrior monks, subject only to the Pope, garrisoned in commanderies across the kingdom, holding castles, estates, and one of the most extensive banking networks in Christendom, its Paris fortress, the strong box, where kings themselves, Philip included, had deposited their treasure. It had been founded 2 centuries earlier to guard pilgrims on the roads to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was lost now, and the order remained, rich, armed, autonomous, and aging, an anomaly in the lawyer's tidy kingdom. And the king owed it money. Through the late summer of 1307, the royal chancery was unusually busy, and unusually quiet. Sealed letters went out to every bailey and seneschal in France, with orders not to be opened before the night of October the 12th. The seals broke in the small hours of Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, and the Kingdom of France moved as one body. In Paris, before dawn, royal officers with men-at-arms surrounded the temple, the walled fortress compound whose keep was the strongest tower in the city, and took its garrison of monks without a fight. In Normandy, in Champagne, in the Languedoc, in every district of France. The same scene ran on the same morning. Bailiffs and seneschals reading out the same warrant at the gates of commanderies, farms, and preceptories. Nobody recorded a final national count. And the archives show the scale instead. Arrests in every corner of the kingdom, from the Grand Master himself, Jacques de Molay, who had walked in a royal funeral procession beside the king one day earlier, down to elderly farm brothers who had never held a sword. The operation had required months of preparation, hundreds of sealed packets, and perfect secrecy across an entire kingdom. And the secrecy had held. Nothing about the arrests was legal in any sense. The previous century would have recognized. The Templars answered to the Pope alone, and no king on earth held jurisdiction over one of them. Philip's warrant brushed the objection aside with a phrase of Nogaret's manufacture, the king acting at the request of the Inquisitor of France, as the defender of the faith, in an emergency that permitted no delay. Pause on the machine before the horror starts, because the machine is the point of this whole story. 100 years earlier, the Crown of France could not arrest one rebellious lord in its own backyard without a military campaign. 200 years earlier, it could not safely ride from Paris to Orléans. The government that broke the seals that Friday reached every district of the largest kingdom in Western Europe, simultaneously, in secret, with paperwork. The instrument the Capetians had spent 3 centuries assembling, the bailiffs, the registers, the couriers, the salaried men who did what Paris ordered, had just shown its full reach in a single morning, and the demonstration frightened, thoughtful men more than any army could have, an army you could see coming. The target was chosen with the same cold intelligence. The Order of the Temple had been founded 2 centuries before. 9 poor knights guarding pilgrims on the Jerusalem roads, and it had grown into a multinational corporation with a private army, answerable only to Rome, holding estates across Europe and running a banking network that moved money across the known world. A merchant could deposit silver at the temple in London and draw it in the East against a coded letter. Kings kept their treasure in Templar vaults, and the French crown itself had banked at the Paris temple for generations, and Philip had sheltered behind its walls from the currency riots. And Philip owed the order money. Then, in 1291, the last Crusader city fell, and the order lost its reason for existing while keeping its wealth, its privileges, and its arrogance. Rich, armed, exempt, and purposeless, it sat inside the lawyers' France like a foreign object, and the lawyers had been studying it for years. The charges were designed for maximum annihilation. The brothers were accused of denying Christ at their secret initiations, spitting on the cross, worshipping an idol, and of institutionalized corruption of the flesh. The dossier came from paid informers and expelled brothers, and it was constructed on the same principle Nogaret had used against Boniface. Make the crime so monstrous that the accusation itself does the destroying. And then the confessions began. And here this story has to walk carefully and honestly, because this is the ground where conspiracy theories breed. The confessions were real, in the sense that men really spoke them. Within weeks, dozens of brothers in Paris, including Jacques de Molay himself, admitted to some version of the denial and the spitting. What produced the admissions is also in the record, because the inquisitors kept minutes. The prisoners were chained in darkness, starved, deprived of the sacraments, and tortured, with the rack, with fire, with the strappado that dislocated shoulders. One brother came to a later hearing carrying, in a box, small bones that had fallen from his own feet after the burning, and showed them to the commissioners. Dozens died under interrogation in Paris alone. Men subjected to such treatment confess to whatever ends it, and the proof sits in the pattern, because the moment the torture stopped, the confessions started dissolving. When the Pope's own commissioners later held hearings where torture was suspended, brothers retracted by the hundred, declaring the initiations innocent and the admissions extracted, knowing exactly what retraction would cost them. In 1310, the Archbishop of Sens, brother of one of the king's ministers, answered the retractions by declaring 54 Templars relapsed heretics, and burned them in a field outside Paris in a single day. The burnings did what they were designed to do. The retractions largely stopped. Modern historians, working from the surviving trial records, including a Vatican parchment rediscovered in 2001, showing that Clement's own commission privately absolved the leaders of heresy while holding them guilty of lesser offences, converge on a sober verdict. There was no secret Templar religion. There was an old, rich, complacent order with some crude barracks room initiation rituals, a monarchy that wanted its wealth and feared its independence, and a legal machine that could manufacture truth by procedure. The mystery-mongering that has grown around the order for 7 centuries, hidden treasures, secret bloodlines, survivals in disguise, is a crop grown in the space where the archives are silent. And this story leaves it in the bookshops. What the documents show is bad enough. A state destroyed an order of the church with its own instruments, in public, and got away with it. The Pope tried to resist and demonstrated, in the trying, what Avignon meant. Clement V protested the arrests, suspended the inquisitors, took the process into papal hands, and for 4 years fought a rearguard action of delays. Philip answered with escalations from the Boniface playbook, threats to try the dead Pope's bones for heresy, assemblies of the realm, pamphlets, and, finally, the 54 burnings, which settled the question of who controlled the tempo. In 1312, at the Council of Vienne, with royal troops in the neighbourhood and the king in attendance, Clement dissolved the order of the temple, carefully, by administrative decree rather than judicial verdict. No finding of guilt ever pronounced. The property was assigned to the rival Hospitaller order, minus the crown's expenses, which the crown calculated generously. The brothers not burned or dead in custody were pensioned into other houses, and the richest institution in Christendom simply ceased. Its Paris fortress passed in time to the crown, and this story will visit that tower once more before the end, in a far later century, with another royal family inside it under guard. The last scene belongs to the old man who had carried a royal coffin the day before the arrests. Jacques de Molay had confessed under duress, retracted, confessed, again under pressure, and spent 7 years in royal custody while the lawyers arranged his order's funeral. In March of 1314, the surviving leadership was brought out onto a scaffold before Notre Dame to hear their final sentence, perpetual imprisonment, and the ceremony was scripted to end in penitent silence. It did not. De Molay, past 70 now, stepped forward and said, loudly, to the crowd, the thing he had 7 years to prepare. The order was innocent. The rule was holy, the confessions were lies, and his own lie, spoken in fear of torture, was the sin he now repented. The prelates on the platform, horrified, adjourned in confusion, and the King's Council met that evening and resolved the matter with royal speed. At dusk the same day, de Molay and one companion who had joined his retraction were rowed to a small island in the Seine, in sight of the towers of Notre Dame, and burned alive as relapsed heretics. Witnesses recorded that the old man asked to be turned toward the cathedral, and died without crying out, and that after dark, people waded to the island to gather ashes as relics, which tells you what the crowd, at the end, believed. Then came the year that built the legend. Within 5 weeks, Pope Clement V was dead of a long illness. Within 8 months, Philip the Fair, 56 and never sick, suffered what modern readers of the sources take for a massive stroke while hunting, and died in November of 1314. The coincidence was irresistible, and within a generation, chroniclers had supplied the missing scene. The Grand Master, in the flames, summoning Pope and King to meet him before the judgment seat of God within the year. The summons is legend, first recorded after the fact, and this story files it exactly there. While noting what the legend fed on, both men really did die on schedule, and the deaths kept coming. And what happened to the sons of Philip the Fair over the following 14 years would convince all Europe that somebody up there had heard the old man, whether or not he ever spoke. The legend had one more strange harvest ahead of it. 6 centuries later, a French novelist named Maurice Druon took the curse of the Grand Master as the engine for a cycle of novels called Les Rois Maudits, the Accursed Kings, chronicling everything this story is about to tell. An American writer named George R. Martin read them, and called Druon's series the original Game of Thrones, and acknowledged it as an inspiration for his own. The superstition around Friday the 13th has murkier roots, and the popular habit of tracing it to the Templar arrests is modern. The date itself needs no superstition. It is simply the morning the machine showed its full reach. And the story is frightening enough with the lights on. Philip the Fair went to Saint-Denis in November 1314, leaving the strongest crown in Europe and 3 grown sons to wear it: Louis, Philip, and Charles, healthy men in their 20s, married. The succession, armoured 3 deep. No royal house in Christendom looked further from extinction, and the instrument of the extinction was already inside the walls, because in the spring of that same year, months before the king died, a scandal had detonated inside his own family, and it had done its damage precisely where no lawyer could repair it. The Tower of Nesle stood at the edge of Paris, on the left bank of the Seine, a leftover watchtower of the old city wall, and in the spring of 1314 it gave its name to the scandal that broke the dynasty's spine. The king's daughter set it off, Isabella, married to the King of England, on a visit to her father's court, had earlier given embroidered purses to her 3 sisters-in-law, the young wives of her 3 brothers. Then, at a court function, by the account that came down, she saw 2 of the purses hanging from the belts of 2 Norman knights, brothers named Gautier and Philippe d'Aunay, and she told her father, Philip the Fair put the knights under watch. And the watch reported, and the affair exploded into the open. Two of the three princesses, Marguerite, wife of the heir Louis, and Blanche, wife of young Charles, were convicted of adultery with the two knights, conducted, the accusations said, in the old tower by the river. The third princess, Jeanne, wife of the middle son Philip, was held to have known and concealed, and was confined more gently and later restored. There was nothing gentle anywhere else. The Darnay brothers were tortured, confessed, and were executed in public at Pontoise. By methods the chronicles describe in detail, this story does not need a punishment calibrated to the crime of touching the vessel of the royal blood. The princesses were shorn and sent to underground cells in a Norman fortress. Marguerite, wife of the future king, died in hers within the year, of cold and neglect by the kindest account, by strangulation on order in the persistent whisper. Grasp what the affair did beneath the cruelty, because the cruelty was survivable and the doubt was not. The whole architecture of this family, 327 years of it, rested on one certainty, that the king's son was the king's son. Marguerite had a small daughter, Jeanne, 4 years old, heir presumptive of France after her father. From the spring of 1314, no oath could establish whose child she was. The lawyers could confiscate an order of monks and arrest a pope, and none of their instruments could reach inside a paternity. The machine had met the one variable it could not govern, and the timing now turned lethal, because the men began to die. Philip the Fair went first. In November of that year, his eldest son reigned as Louis X for 18 months, remarried in haste to sire an unquestioned heir, and in June of 1316 he died at 26, reportedly after overheating at a ball game and drinking chilled wine, a death sudden enough to start whispers that never entirely stopped. And the kingdom arrived at a situation with no precedent and no rule in 329 years. A king of France had never once died without a living son. Louis left the tainted small daughter. And one thing more, his new queen, Clémence, was pregnant. France invented an office on the spot for the waiting, and the dead king's brother, Philip, took it, regent of the realm until the birth. Europe held its breath with the midwives. If the child was a boy, he was king of France from his first breath. If a girl, the crisis merely doubled. In November of 1316, in Paris, the queen was delivered, and the child was a son. He was proclaimed at once John I, King of France, a sovereign in swaddling clothes. And Paris rang its bells. 5 days later the bells changed. The infant king was dead, of nothing history can name, an ordinary newborn death in an age full of them, falling on the one cradle in Europe where it altered everything. He is counted in the roll of the kings of France. John I, called the posthumous, reigned 5 days, the shortest in the nation's history. A king who never saw daylight. Whispers about the death began before the tiny coffin reached Saint-Denis, and have never entirely stopped, and rest on nothing provable. What is provable is who moved next. The regent had the little corpse buried, and within weeks had himself crowned at Rheims as Philip V, with armed men at the doors of the cathedral, against the objections of those who held that the crown belonged to the dead king's daughter. The 4-year-old Jean, An assembly gathered in Paris ratified the accomplished fact, and the reasoning that surrounded it deserves one honest minute, because a durable myth was born here. Later centuries would say France had an ancient fundamental law, the Salic law, excluding women from the throne since the days of the Franks. The truth runs backward. In 1316, there was no such law. There was a nervous political class, a candidate with an army in place, a rival who was a small girl under a cloud of adultery, and a decision that suited nearly everyone with power. The assembly blessed it with the broad phrase that a woman did not succeed to the crown of France. Custom was then declared to have always existed, and the antique Frankish law code was dug out by scholars decades later and retrofitted under the decision as a foundation. France did not follow the rule. France manufactured the rule in a crisis to license an outcome, and then aged the paperwork. The manufactured rule then governed the monarchy for its remaining 5 centuries. Constitutions are sometimes born this way, and this story simply shows the birth. Philip V then demonstrated the family fate with the precision of a theorem. He was the ablest of the brothers, a genuine administrator, and he reigned 6 years and produced 5 daughters and 1 son who died in infancy. In 1322 he sickened and died at 29, and the rule he had built to take the crown now took it from his own girls and passed it to his brother. Charles IV, the last brother, reigned 6 years in his turn, buried 1 wife. Annulled the imprisoned Blanche, married 2 more, fathered daughters and a son who died at birth. In the first days of 1328, he took ill at Vincennes, and the kingdom watched the pattern close in with something like superstitious dread, because every man of the direct line was now dead except the one dying. The entire future of the House of Capet had contracted, for the second time in 12 years, to the belly of a pregnant queen. Charles, from his deathbed, gave the only order left to give. If the child was a son, the realm would be his. If a girl, then the great men should give the crown where it belonged. On the 1st of February, 1328, he died at 33, and France stopped, and waited. Again. The wait lasted 2 months, a regency to the nearest adult male cousin, Philippe of Valois, ambassadors idling in Paris, the chancery dating documents to the first year of the vacancy of the throne, a formula no French clerk had ever written. On the 1st of April, 1328, at Vincennes, Queen Jeanne d'Evreux was delivered of her child, and the child was a daughter. That sentence ends the House of Capet, 341 years, from the election at Noyon to a birth chamber at Vincennes, 15 kings, counting the 5-day infant, and France counts him, father to son, without one single break, for 11 generations, a run of dynastic luck, with hardly a parallel in the history of European monarchy. And then, inside 12 years, 3 healthy brothers and 2 posthumous babies, and the line was gone, hunted down. Men said in the taverns and the chronicles alike, by the last cry of the Grand Master on the island. The story does not need the curse. 14 years of ordinary mortality, arriving in an extraordinary place, did all of this by itself. The tavern version was simply cheaper to believe. An assembly of barons and prelates gathered within the month and gave the crown to the regent, Philip of Valois, grandson of Philip III, through a younger son. a Capetian of the blood in unbroken male descent, first king of the House of Valois. The strongest rival claim was closer by blood and fatal by definition. Edward III, the young King of England, was the son of Isabella, the daughter of Philip the Fair, the very princess whose sharp eyes had started the Nestlé affair. By simple proximity he was the dead king's nephew, nearer than any Valois cousin. His claim ran through his mother, and the doctrine, manufactured in 1316, now did its work at scale. The assembly holding that a woman could not transmit what she could not hold. Nobody consulted the 16-year-old in London, who protested, then rendered homage for Gascony, then bided. 9 years later, pressed by Philip of Valois over Gascony and Scotland, Edward reached back to his mother's blood, quartered the golden lilies of France with the leopards of England on his royal arms, and claimed the crown of France as his own. The war that began then ran, with intermissions, for 116 years. Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, a peasant girl from Lorraine, burned at Rouen and sainted 5 centuries on. At Law, it started in the birth chamber at Vincennes on the 1st of April, 1328. In the minute after, the midwife looked up, and here, at the end, look at what did not happen in that minute, because it is the whole meaning of this story. The throne of France stood empty of Capetian sons, and France did not shake. No duke rose, no province seceded, no tower lords reappeared on the roads. The baillis kept their accounts through the vacancy. The Parliament heard it cases. The Trésor des Chartes stayed locked and catalogued. The realm passed from one dynasty to the next by committee and paperwork. In 8 weeks, without one sword drawn, and the very smoothness was the monument. Hugh Capet's France had been a crown with no kingdom under it. His descendants' France was a kingdom that no longer strictly needed the family that built it, a state that could survive the extinction of its makers, which is, if a dynasty can be said to have a masterpiece, the strangest masterpiece a dynasty ever made. The blood itself refused to end. The Valois were Capetians by the male line, and when the Valois failed in their turn, the crown passed to the Bourbons, Capetians by the male line from a younger son of St. Louis. Bourbon kings reigned in Paris until the Revolution came for them, and when it did, the prison that held the last of them was the Temple, the old fortress of the arrested knights, still standing after 5 centuries. The name the revolutionary clerks entered on the death warrant of Louis XVI was not a royal title. Kings had no surnames, so the clerks reached back and gave him the only family name the line had ever had, Louis Capet, and south of the Pyrenees the male line runs on today, through the Bourbon kings of Spain, father to son, back to the Duke, elected at Senlis more than 1,000 years ago. The road is still there too. It runs southwest out of Paris toward Orléans, under the Orta route and the wheat, past the town of Montlhéry, where the hill still carries the ruined tower that once made a king of France old before his time. Drivers pass it in 20 minutes and never look up. Nobody pays a toll. Nobody rides armed. It is the most ordinary stretch of country in France. And that, 341 years of one family's work, is exactly what it cost to make it ordinary